Time leaves numbers behind, yet stone remembers what calendars forget. In 3,000 years, a single monument can outlive empires, languages, and names. Then come the anomalies: impossible measurements, sealed passages, unfamiliar symbols, objects appearing centuries too early. Each clue adds another equation, and the answer keeps moving farther from us. Rising from the Judean hills, Herodium appears almost unnatural against the landscape. Its enormous, truncated cone dominates the horizon, its slopes descending in precise geometric lines before dissolving into the surrounding terrain. At first glance, it resembles a mountain shaped by nature, but the closer one looks, the more obvious the intervention becomes. This hill was not simply occupied, it was transformed. Herodium was constructed by Herod the Great during the final decades of the 1st century BC, probably beginning around 23 BC. The site was both a fortress and an extravagant royal complex, positioned roughly 12 kilometers south of Jerusalem. Herod chose the location with extraordinary care. From its summit, the surrounding countryside could be observed for considerable distances, while the artificial mountain itself became a monumental statement visible across the landscape. The engineering was remarkable. Herod's builders raised the mountain into a symmetrical cone, surrounding its upper section with massive defensive walls and towers. Inside were reception rooms, living quarters, storage areas, courtyards, and elaborate architectural features. Water had to be transported and stored in large quantities, while underground passages and cisterns were carved into the bedrock. Yet Herodium was more than a fortified palace. It was designed as a monument to Herod himself. At the summit stood a circular palace fortress, while lower on the slope was another extensive complex containing gardens, pools, baths, and a large swimming pool. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered a small theater with an unusual royal box overlooking the stage. The combination is revealing. This was not merely a military stronghold. It was a carefully engineered landscape of power, spectacle, and memory. Then came the discovery that changed the site's story. In 2007, archaeologist Ehud Netzer announced the identification of what he believed to be Herod's tomb on the eastern slope of the mountain. The structure contained fragments of an elaborate limestone sarcophagus, and its monumental setting appeared consistent with a royal burial. The identification has become widely accepted, although some aspects of the burial complex and the circumstances surrounding Herod's final resting place continue to invite discussion. Herod died in 4 BC. According to the ancient historian Josephus, his funeral was extraordinarily elaborate. Yet, the physical remains of the king himself have not survived in a form that allows absolute certainty about every detail of his burial. The tomb had been damaged in antiquity, and the sarcophagus itself was found broken into numerous pieces. Why? The destruction may have occurred during later periods of political upheaval. Herodium was caught in conflicts long after Herod's death, including the Jewish revolt against Roman rule in the 1st century AD. Parts of the complex were altered, occupied, abandoned, and eventually transformed into ruins. But the mountain still contains peculiar details. Its interior is penetrated by tunnels, stairways, cisterns, and hidden spaces. Some were practical, designed to move water or people through the enormous complex. Others belonged to later inhabitants who adapted Herod's architecture to their own needs. And then there is the mountain itself. Why construct such an enormous artificial monument around a palace that already possessed natural elevation? Was the purpose primarily defensive, symbolic, commemorative, or all three at once? Herodium may have functioned as a royal palace, fortress, theatrical center, and gigantic funerary monument simultaneously. More speculative interpretations have suggested that its unusual geometry carried astronomical or symbolic intentions. Such ideas remain difficult to demonstrate, and there is no firm evidence that Herodium was designed as some kind of hidden scientific instrument. Yet, the precision of its construction inevitably raises questions about what Herod wanted the landscape itself to communicate. Perhaps that is the most enduring mystery. Herodium was built to make one man's presence permanent. Centuries later, the man is gone, his palace is broken, and his burial monument survives only in fragments. Yet, beneath the stone, behind sealed passages and altered foundations, traces of the original design may still remain undiscovered. And if the mountain was constructed to preserve a memory, how much of Herod's original intention has already been lost, and how much might still be waiting inside the hill? The mountain of Herodium leaves us with a peculiar thought. Sometimes a monument is designed not merely to shelter people, but to shape the landscape around them. Far across the world, another monumental landscape raises a similar question. Here, however, there is no single artificial mountain dominating the horizon. Instead, dozens of enormous earthen pyramids rise from the dry coastal plain of northern Peru, forming one of the most unusual archaeological landscapes in the Americas. This is Túcume. Spread across the La Leche Valley, the site contains more than 24 major pyramidal structures, constructed largely from millions of adobe bricks. From a distance, many appear almost like natural hills, their weathered surfaces softened by centuries of wind and rain. But beneath that eroded exterior lies evidence of deliberate planning, repeated rebuilding, and an architectural tradition that continued for generations. Túcume developed during the later part of the first millennium AD and became an important center associated with the Lambayeque, or Sican, cultural tradition. Later, the Chimu incorporated the region into their expanding political world, followed by the Inca. Each society left traces behind, transforming the site rather than simply replacing what came before. That layered history is one of Túcume's most intriguing features. The pyramids were not all built at the same moment. Some were expanded repeatedly, with new structures placed over earlier ones. Platforms, ramps, courtyards, plazas, and ceremonial spaces gradually accumulated, creating an architectural landscape whose final form was the product of centuries. Why keep rebuilding the same monumental spaces? The conventional explanation is deeply connected to power and religion. Túcume appears to have been a major ceremonial and political center, where rulers could organize labor, conduct rituals, receive visitors, and demonstrate authority. Its enormous pyramids would have made that authority physically visible across the valley. Yet, their scale remains difficult to comprehend. These were earthen monuments rather than carefully cut stone temples. Adobe bricks could be produced in enormous quantities, allowing communities to construct structures of astonishing dimensions. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of workshops, residences, burials, ritual activity, and specialized spaces surrounding the pyramids. The mystery, therefore, is not simply how the pyramids were built. It is why this particular landscape became so important. One of the most striking structures is Huaca Larga, an immense platform complex stretching for hundreds of meters. Its scale suggests that Túcume was not a small ceremonial settlement, but a major center capable of coordinating substantial populations and resources. Then there are the burials. Human remains and offerings discovered throughout the region reveal a complex relationship between death, authority, and sacred space. Some individuals were buried with objects indicating status or ritual significance. Such discoveries raise another possibility. Perhaps the pyramids were not merely places where ceremonies occurred, but landscapes where political legitimacy was repeatedly connected to ancestral memory. Later traditions added another layer to the story. According to local legend recorded in the early 20th century, Túcume was associated with the arrival of a mysterious founding figure named Namelap, who was said to have come from across the sea with followers. The story belongs to a much later oral tradition and cannot be treated as straightforward historical evidence. Yet, its persistence is fascinating. Could such traditions preserve distant memories of migration, political change, or cultural encounters? Mainstream archaeology does not require an overseas origin to explain Túcume. The site's development can be understood through regional cultural processes, technological knowledge, trade networks, and political transformation. Still, legends of foreign arrivals have encouraged more speculative interpretations, including theories of distant transoceanic contact. There is no conclusive evidence establishing such a connection. And perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what makes Túcume compelling. The pyramids have endured because adobe can survive when protected, but erosion has also erased enormous portions of their original appearance. What we see today is only the remaining surface of a much larger architectural story. Under layers of earth may still lie earlier walls, forgotten burials, ritual objects, and evidence capable of changing our understanding of the people who built this extraordinary landscape. Túcume does not offer an easy answer. It offers scale, repetition, legend, and silence. And as the pyramids fade into the surrounding plain, one question remains suspended over the ruins. How much of the story has already been recovered, and how much is still concealed beneath the earth? The earthen pyramids of Túcume leave the landscape looking almost unreal, their enormous forms slowly surrendering to wind and time. But in the eastern Andes, the mystery takes another shape. There, deep among steep mountains, dense vegetation, and narrow valleys, carefully fitted stones emerge from the forest, remnants of a world that seems deliberately hidden from the wider landscape. This is the region of Vilcabamba, the remote territory that became the final stronghold of the Inca resistance after the Spanish conquest. Unlike the open ceremonial landscape of Túcume, Vilcabamba is defined by isolation. Mountains rise sharply around the valleys, rivers cut through difficult terrain, and tropical vegetation can conceal walls, terraces, foundations, and roads within surprisingly short periods of time. Among these landscapes are stone-built remains associated with the last decades of the Inca state, including the important settlement of Espiritu Pampa, often identified with the historical Vilcabamba of the final Inca rulers. The setting itself raises an immediate question. Why establish a major center in such a difficult environment? The practical explanation is compelling. After the capture and execution of Atahualpa, the Inca state fractured under Spanish pressure. Manco Inca retreated eastward, eventually establishing a political center in the Vilcabamba region. Its geography offered natural protection, while the surrounding valleys provided access to agricultural land and routes through the mountains. Here, survival depended upon concealment. The architecture reflects that environment. Stone walls were constructed using techniques characteristic of Inca building traditions, while terraces transformed steep slopes into productive agricultural ground. Roads and pathways connected settlements separated by formidable terrain. Water management systems helped sustain communities where rainfall could be abundant, but controlled cultivation remained essential. Yet, Vilcabamba is difficult to understand because much of it has been obscured, not only by vegetation, but by history itself. Spanish accounts describe the final Inca realm, but their descriptions were written from outside a society that had become increasingly inaccessible. Some locations mentioned in historical records were difficult to identify with certainty for centuries. Explorers searched the mountains for the last Inca capital, sometimes attaching the name Vilcabamba to ruins that later proved to be different places. That confusion gave the landscape an almost legendary quality. One of the most significant discoveries came with renewed archaeological investigation at Espiritu Pampa. The site revealed substantial architecture, including stone foundations and structures suggesting that it had been an important settlement during the final period of Inca resistance. Archaeologists also found evidence connecting the site to broader Andean traditions and to the political world of the late Inca state. But was this truly the Vilcabamba described by the chronicles? The identification has become widely accepted, although questions about the exact historical sequence of settlements and the relationship between different locations remain subjects of archaeological investigation. More speculative interpretations have gone further. Some have suggested that hidden settlements in the Vilcabamba Mountains could preserve structures that have not yet been fully documented, perhaps extending far beyond the sites currently known. Others have imagined that the final Inca rulers deliberately concealed ceremonial spaces, royal possessions, or records from their enemies. There is little evidence for dramatic hidden chambers filled with lost treasures. Yet, the basic premise is less implausible than it might sound. The geography of Vilcabamba is genuinely capable of concealing archaeological remains. Remote valleys remain difficult to survey. Dense vegetation can cover walls. Landslides can bury structures. And entire terraces may appear from a distance to be nothing more than natural contours. Even the stonework invites closer attention. Inca builders were capable of producing walls with remarkably tight joints, using irregularly shaped stones fitted together with considerable precision. At Vilcabamba, however, the environment introduced different architectural challenges. Materials, terrain, available labor, and the need for rapid construction all influenced what was built. The result is not one monumental complex frozen in time, but a fragmented landscape shaped by retreat, adaptation, warfare, agriculture, and memory. Perhaps that is why Vilcabamba remains so compelling. The final Inca stronghold was not simply abandoned when its political world collapsed. Structures continued to decay beneath vegetation, while stories of the last rulers passed into chronicles, oral traditions, and later exploration. Somewhere among those mountains, the boundary between what is known and what has disappeared becomes difficult to define. A wall may belong to a settlement. A terrace may conceal an earlier structure. A path may lead toward a place that has never been fully excavated. And if the mountains once protected the final generation of Inca rulers from the outside world, how much of their hidden landscape might still remain beyond the reach of archaeology? The mountains of Vilcabamba disappear behind us, leaving a landscape where stone was shaped by survival. Far to the east, the setting changes completely. Here, the mountains give way to a vast, arid plain, where the wind moves across the remains of a city that once stood at the crossroads of ancient civilizations. Low walls, fired bricks, ash, and fragments of architecture emerge from the earth. This is Shahr-e Sukhteh, the burnt city in southeastern Iran. The name itself seems almost prophetic. Yet, the archaeological story is more complicated. Shahr-e Sukhteh flourished roughly between 3200 and 1800 BC, becoming one of the most important settlements of the ancient Helmand Basin. Its inhabitants practiced agriculture, craft production, trade, and long-distance exchange across a region connecting the Iranian plateau with Central and South Asia. Among the remains are structures associated with ritual activity and fire, but the phrase "fire temple base" requires caution. Archaeologists have uncovered architectural remains and evidence of controlled fire at Shahr-e Sukhteh, but identifying a specific structure as a formal fire temple is not as certain as the name might suggest. The modern label can make the site sound more definitive than the evidence allows, and that uncertainty is where the mystery begins. Fire was central to many ancient societies. It could illuminate, purify, transform materials, accompany offerings, or mark a sacred space. At Shahr-e Sukhteh, however, archaeologists are still reconstructing exactly how particular buildings were used. Was a particular foundation connected to ritual ceremonies? Could fire have been used for religious purposes, industrial activity, or both? The answer may not be preserved in the architecture alone. Shahr-e Sukhteh was a highly organized settlement. Excavations have revealed residential quarters, craft areas, burial grounds, drainage systems, workshops, and substantial quantities of artifacts. There is evidence for specialized production, including pottery and metalworking. The inhabitants also participated in extensive exchange networks, with objects and materials indicating connections far beyond the immediate region. Then, there are the discoveries that have given the city an almost unsettling reputation. One burial contained an artificial eyeball made from organic material and other components, dating to the 3rd millennium BC. Another famous discovery is an early prosthetic or artificial-looking object associated with the human body. A remarkably sophisticated board game has also been found, along with evidence of advanced craft techniques. None of these objects require supernatural explanations. They demonstrate something more interesting: technological creativity appearing in a society whose complexity is sometimes underestimated. The possible ritual structures add another dimension. If fire was deliberately maintained in certain areas, its purpose could have ranged from practical heat and production to symbolic ceremonies. Ancient people did not necessarily separate technology, religion, and daily life in the modern way. A workshop, shrine, or domestic space could have served multiple functions over time. Yet, Shahr-e Sukhteh eventually declined. Around 1800 BC, the settlement was abandoned, although the precise reasons remain uncertain. Environmental change, shifting water resources, economic transformations, changing trade routes, and regional political developments have all been considered as possible factors. No single explanation completely resolves the story. The city then remained silent beneath the desert. That silence preserved an extraordinary archaeological record, but it also created gaps. Buildings collapsed. Organic materials disappeared. Later, erosion altered the surface. Even when foundations survive, their original function can be difficult to reconstruct. This is particularly important when interpreting a supposed fire temple. A darkened floor does not automatically prove a religious ceremony. An ash deposit can result from several activities. A carefully constructed foundation may belong to a building whose walls and upper elements have vanished entirely. Still, the possibility of a dedicated ritual space remains intriguing. If people gathered around controlled flames here thousands of years ago, what did those flames represent to them? Were they offerings to unseen powers, symbols of purification, tools within a ceremony, or something whose meaning has been completely lost? And perhaps somewhere beneath the surviving foundations, another layer remains. A wall fragment, an undisturbed floor, a forgotten installation. Shahr-e Sukhteh has already forced archaeology to reconsider what early urban societies were capable of achieving. Yet, the precise meaning of some structures remains uncertain. The city gave archaeologists remarkable objects, sophisticated architecture, and traces of a vanished community. But if one of its fire-associated foundations truly belonged to a sacred space, the purpose of the flame, and the beliefs surrounding it, may still be waiting beneath the dust. The flames of Shahr-e Sukhteh disappear into the dust of an ancient desert, leaving behind a question about spaces whose original meanings have been erased by time. Far to the northwest, another landscape seems to reverse the relationship between human beings and architecture. Here, buildings do not rise from the ground. They descend into the stone itself. In the valleys around Göreme, in central Anatolia, pale volcanic rock has been carved into towers, rooms, chapels, tunnels, and entire underground spaces. Tall formations known as fairy chimneys stand across the landscape, their narrow shafts and darker caps giving them an almost deliberate appearance. From a distance, they resemble monuments shaped by an unknown architect. Up close, the marks of human intervention become unmistakable. The explanation begins with geology. Millions of years ago, volcanic eruptions deposited thick layers of ash across the region. Over immense periods, that ash hardened into a relatively soft rock called tuff. Wind and water gradually sculpted the softer material, while harder layers resisted erosion. The result was a landscape of pillars, ridges, valleys, and strangely shaped pinnacles. Nature created the raw forms. Human beings then began carving into them. By the early medieval period, communities had transformed many of these formations into dwellings, storage spaces, monasteries, chapels, and places of worship. Some interiors contain columns, arches, stairways, benches, and carefully cut rooms. Others preserve painted murals depicting Christian religious scenes. The Göreme area eventually became one of the most important monastic landscapes in Cappadocia. But when did this transformation truly begin? That question is harder to answer than the surviving architecture might suggest. People had occupied Cappadocia long before the Christian communities that made Göreme famous. The region's caves and rock shelters offered natural protection and could be adapted for habitation. Later, inhabitants inherited an environment already shaped by generations of human activity. The result is a landscape where different periods overlap. A room may have begun as a practical shelter and later become a religious space. A passage may have connected buildings that no longer survive. A doorway can lead into a chamber whose original purpose is uncertain. And then there are the underground complexes. Across Cappadocia, enormous subterranean settlements such as Derinkuyu and Kaymaklu extend through multiple levels below the surface. They contain ventilation shafts, storage rooms, wells, passageways, and spaces capable of sheltering large communities. Their existence has encouraged speculation about secret civilizations, lost technologies, and hidden networks connecting distant sites. The more restrained explanation is already remarkable. These complexes could have developed gradually, responding to security concerns, environmental conditions, and the practical advantages of underground living. Their construction did not require mysterious technology. Soft volcanic rock could be excavated with relatively simple tools, while the resulting spaces offered insulation and protection. Still, the scale raises questions. How were ventilation systems planned so deeply underground? How did builders navigate complex passages without modern surveying instruments? How long did it take to transform natural formations into organized settlements? Archaeology can answer some of these questions, but not all. At Göreme itself, the painted churches create another layer of mystery. Frescoes preserve faces, gestures, symbols, and scenes that reveal the beliefs of the communities who created them. Yet, many paintings were damaged deliberately, naturally faded, or altered by later occupants. The walls therefore preserve both information and absence. What once stood above a doorway may have disappeared. What a particular room meant may no longer be obvious. Even the sequence in which certain spaces were carved can be difficult to reconstruct. More speculative interpretations sometimes suggest that Cappadocia's carved landscapes conceal a much older story, that some structures began thousands of years before the periods normally associated with their surviving religious architecture. There is limited evidence for such sweeping claims, and most documented features can be explained through known historical populations and successive phases of occupation. But the possibility of earlier, poorly preserved activity cannot simply be dismissed wherever archaeological evidence remains incomplete. That is the tension at Göreme. The landscape looks extraordinary because geology made it unusual. Human beings then recognized the possibilities hidden inside that geology and gradually transformed it into something even more complex. Stone became shelter. Shelter became monastery. Passage became sanctuary. And a landscape shaped by erosion became a record of civilizations adapting to the same unusual terrain across centuries. Yet, beneath the painted surfaces, behind blocked entrances, and inside rooms whose original functions remain uncertain, fragments of another story may still survive. If Göreme is only partially understood, how many layers of human activity remain concealed within the soft volcanic stone? And what might the next excavation reveal about the people who first decided to carve their world into the earth? The carved valleys of Göreme remind us that stone can become architecture without ever being removed from the earth. Yet, on a remote island in the Pacific, stone was treated differently. There, enormous slabs were quarried, transported, positioned, and fitted into a platform overlooking the ocean. The landscape is stark, volcanic, and immense. This is Ahu Vinapu on Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island. The platform stands among a landscape filled with monumental stone structures called Ahu, many associated with Moai statues. Vinapu is particularly intriguing because of the precision visible in portions of its masonry. Large basalt blocks form a retaining wall, with several stones fitted closely enough that the joints appear remarkably controlled. At first glance, the construction seems almost out of place. The stones are irregular, yet some surfaces meet with surprising accuracy. Certain blocks are large and heavy, requiring considerable labor simply to move them into position. The result has inspired comparisons with the sophisticated stonework found in the Andes. That comparison has become one of the most persistent mysteries surrounding Vinapu. The conventional archaeological interpretation is less dramatic, but no less impressive. Rapa Nui communities developed their own monumental architectural traditions over centuries, adapting available volcanic stone to construct ceremonial platforms. The island's inhabitants were capable of organizing substantial labor forces and moving heavy materials using techniques that remain subjects of archaeological study. The exact construction date of Vinapu is also important. Radiocarbon evidence and broader archaeological studies place the development of Rapa Nui's monumental architecture within the island's Polynesian settlement history, with Vinapu traditionally associated with later prehistoric phases. The platform was not necessarily constructed as a single project. Like many monuments on Rapa Nui, it may represent rebuilding and modification over time. So, why does the masonry attract so much attention? Part of the answer lies in its appearance. Some blocks are carefully shaped and fitted without the extensive use of mortar. The stones appear to lock into one another through their geometry and weight. In a region where monumental construction was accomplished with stone tools and human labor, that precision demonstrates considerable knowledge of material, balance, and structural stability. Then came the comparisons. In the 19th and 20th centuries, travelers and researchers began drawing parallels between Vinapu and the massive stonework of South America. The resemblance encouraged theories suggesting that pre-European contact occurred between Polynesia and South America. Modern archaeology provides a more nuanced picture. There is now strong evidence for ancient contact between Polynesian peoples and South America, including genetic and botanical evidence pointing toward interactions between populations. The famous example is the sweet potato, which reached Polynesia long before European voyages. This demonstrates that some form of transoceanic contact occurred. But does that explain Vinapu? Not necessarily. Similarity in masonry does not by itself establish that Andean builders constructed the platform or taught Rapa Nui communities how to build it. Stoneworking techniques can develop independently when builders confront similar structural problems, and the island itself presents extraordinary logistical challenges. Rapa Nui lies thousands of kilometers from continental South America. Every major monument required local resources, organized labor, and a reliable method for transporting stone. The island's inhabitants created an entire monumental culture within this isolated environment. Perhaps the most fascinating question is not whether someone from another continent built Vinapu. It is how much expertise was already present within Rapa Nui society. The platform belongs to a wider tradition that included Ahu, ceremonial spaces, roads, quarrying areas, and the famous moai. These monuments reveal a society capable of coordinating labor across generations. Yet, much remains uncertain. The original appearance of Vinapu may have been different from what survives today. Some elements were damaged or displaced. Archaeological reconstruction can identify building techniques, but it cannot always recover the intentions behind them. More speculative theories propose that Vinapu preserves evidence of a forgotten migration, an earlier culture, or direct architectural influence from the Andes. These ideas remain debated, and the available evidence does not establish a lost pre-Polynesian civilization on Rapa Nui. Still, the broader question of ancient Pacific contact is no longer purely hypothetical. The ocean that once appeared to separate distant peoples may have been a route. And perhaps that changes how Vinapu should be viewed. Not as proof of an impossible connection, but as one fragment within a much larger story of navigation, adaptation, and cultural exchange across an immense ocean. The stones remain where their builders placed them, silent beneath the island's sky. Their surfaces preserve the evidence of hands, tools, weight, and patience, but not the complete story. And if the platform still contains details that have yet to be understood, what might its stones reveal when examined not only for how they were built, but for the forgotten journeys and ideas that may have reached this distant shore? The stones of Vinapu leave us with the image of a monument shaped by human hands on an island at the edge of a vast ocean. But as the journey moves westward, another landscape presents a very different kind of enigma. Here, the stones do not stand alone against the sea. They lie among the remains of an ancient settlement, where layers of construction conceal centuries of changing beliefs. This is Dharamrajika, near Taxila in present-day Pakistan. Set among low hills and ancient routes linking the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia, Dharamrajika is best known for its great Buddhist stupa and surrounding monastic remains. The site belongs primarily to the historic period, not the prehistoric era, and its earliest major development is generally associated with the Mauryan period, traditionally linked to the reign of Ashoka in the 3rd century BC. Yet, beneath the monumental Buddhist architecture lies a more complicated archaeological story. The central stupa rises from a carefully constructed platform, its surviving stonework surrounded by the remains of smaller stupas, chapels, monasteries, and other structures. What appears at first to be a single religious complex is actually the result of repeated construction and modification over centuries. Why did successive communities continue rebuilding the same sacred landscape? The conventional explanation is closely connected with Buddhist pilgrimage and the growth of Taxila as an important intellectual, commercial, and religious center. Dharamrajika stood near routes carrying merchants, travelers, monks, and ideas between regions that today belong to Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Central Asia. The monument therefore occupied more than physical space. It occupied a crossroads. Tradition associates the great stupa with Ashoka, who is said to have distributed relics of the Buddha across numerous locations. Whether every traditional attribution can be confirmed archaeologically is another matter. What can be established is that Dharamrajika became an important Buddhist center, and that relic-related practices played a significant role in the architecture of such sites. The mystery becomes more interesting when the foundations are examined. Large quantities of stone were shaped and positioned to create terraces, retaining walls, platforms, and architectural boundaries. Later, builders modified earlier structures, sometimes covering previous surfaces with new construction. Beneath the visible remains, therefore, are traces of earlier phases that are not always easy to reconstruct. A single wall may belong to one period. A foundation beneath it may belong to another, and the meaning of the same space may have changed completely between them. This layered construction can create an archaeological puzzle. When later builders preserved an earlier foundation, were they respecting its sacred importance, reusing valuable material, or simply adapting an existing structure to a new purpose? There is rarely a single answer. Dharamrajika also sits within the wider archaeological landscape of Taxila, where settlements and monuments developed over many centuries. Greek, Persian, Indian, and later Central Asian influences interacted within the region, producing an unusually diverse cultural environment. That mixture has sometimes encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some theories imagine that certain monumental foundations around Taxila preserve remnants of far older structures whose true purpose has been forgotten. Others suggest that unusual stone platforms may have served functions that modern archaeologists have not yet completely identified. But there is an important distinction between an unanswered question and evidence for a lost civilization. At Dharamrajika, the archaeological record provides substantial evidence for Buddhist religious activity, monastic life, craftsmanship, trade, and successive periods of rebuilding. There is no established evidence that the site belongs to an unknown prehistoric civilization possessing technology beyond its historical context. And yet, uncertainty remains. Archaeological excavation is always selective. Parts of the ancient landscape have disappeared through erosion, later construction, looting, and centuries of environmental change. What survives is only a fragment of the original complex. Even the stones themselves are incomplete witnesses. They can reveal dimensions, construction methods, repairs, and patterns of reuse. They cannot tell us precisely what every visitor thought while standing before the monument, or why particular architectural decisions were made. Perhaps that is what makes Dharamrajika quietly compelling. Its mystery does not depend upon impossible technology or dramatic legends. It emerges from something more subtle, layers of human activity accumulating until the original landscape becomes difficult to separate from everything that came afterward. Beneath one platform may be another phase. Behind one wall may be an earlier design, and below the visible ruins, there may still be archaeological evidence capable of clarifying how this sacred landscape evolved across centuries. The stones have survived. The people who placed them are gone. Their religious world has changed beyond recognition. And somewhere beneath the surviving foundations, the earliest chapter of Dharamrajika's story may still be waiting to be uncovered. The stone foundations of Dharamrajika remind us that monuments can accumulate meaning layer by layer, until the original purpose becomes difficult to separate from everything that came afterward. In the eastern Andes, that same problem takes a more dramatic form. There, an entire mountain surface appears to have been transformed into a monumental carving. High above the valleys of present-day Bolivia, a massive block of red sandstone rises from the surrounding landscape. Its surface is covered with channels, niches, geometric lines, animal forms, and carefully cut depressions. From certain angles, the rock resembles a giant ceremonial platform. From others, it seems almost like a map carved into the mountain. This is Samaipata. The site, officially known as the Archaeological Site of Samaipata, occupies a remarkable position on the eastern slopes of the Andes. It became an important center during the late pre-Columbian period and was later incorporated into the Inca world. The monumental carved rock is its most famous feature, but the surrounding settlement contains terraces, plazas, structures, and other remains that reveal a much larger cultural landscape. The rock itself is the mystery. Known as the El Fuerte Rock, it measures roughly 220 meters long and about 60 meters wide. Its upper surface was deliberately modified, creating channels and carvings whose purposes are not always immediately obvious. Why carve an entire mountain surface? The most accepted interpretations connect the rock with ritual and ceremonial activities. Some channels may have been designed to guide liquids during ceremonies. Others may have represented symbolic divisions, sacred pathways, or astronomical references. The exact meanings, however, remain uncertain, and that uncertainty has allowed speculation to grow. Earlier travelers sometimes interpreted the carvings through the lens of European ideas about fortifications, giving rise to the site's misleading name, El Fuerte, or the fortress. Archaeology has shown that the complex was not simply a military fortress. Its significance appears to have been religious, political, and ceremonial. The surrounding architecture provides important clues. Inca style remains occupy parts of the site, but Samaipata was not necessarily created entirely by the Inca. Earlier groups, particularly the Chane, occupied the region before Inca expansion. The site therefore reflects interaction between different cultural traditions rather than the work of a single population. At some point, the Inca recognized the strategic and symbolic importance of Samaipata and incorporated it into their expanding imperial network. Its position was valuable. From the eastern slopes of the Andes, routes extended toward the lowlands, connecting environments that differed dramatically in climate, resources, and culture. Samaipata may therefore have functioned as a frontier center as well as a ceremonial location. Yet, the carved rock remains difficult to decode. Some grooves form straight or curved patterns. Others create geometric shapes and channels. Animal representations, including serpent-like and feline forms, have been identified in portions of the carving. Some researchers have suggested that the designs could relate to cosmology, fertility, water, or ritual movement. There is no universally accepted interpretation. More speculative theories have proposed that the rock represents an astronomical instrument, a sophisticated calendar, or even evidence of a civilization possessing knowledge far beyond what conventional archaeology attributes to the region. Such interpretations are difficult to demonstrate. The presence of astronomical alignments at ancient sites does not automatically mean that the entire structure was designed as an observatory. Likewise, geometric carvings do not necessarily encode mathematical information. Without written records from the people who created the designs, researchers must reconstruct meaning from context, comparison, and physical evidence. Still, the scale of the carving is undeniable. Someone, or more accurately, generations of people, invested enormous effort in reshaping the sandstone. They selected this particular mountain surface and transformed it into something that was neither ordinary architecture nor untouched nature. That choice is perhaps more mysterious than any individual carving. Why here? Why this rock? And why create such an elaborate network of channels and symbols across its surface? Over time, erosion has softened many details. Some carvings are difficult to distinguish from natural fractures. Others were damaged by weathering and human activity. What survives may represent only part of the original design. Samaipata therefore exists somewhere between landscape and monument. Nature provided the mountain. Human beings imposed order upon it. Religion may have supplied the meaning, and centuries later, much of that meaning has disappeared. The surrounding ruins tell us that Samaipata was part of a complex society connected to wider political and cultural networks. The carved rock tells us that those people saw something in this landscape worth transforming on an extraordinary scale. But the symbols remain silent. Perhaps they recorded rituals whose details are lost. Perhaps the channels once carried liquids whose symbolic significance is forgotten. Perhaps some of the patterns reflected celestial observations, seasonal cycles, or sacred geography. Or perhaps their meaning was simpler, more practical, and more deeply tied to traditions that left no written explanation. The stone remains. Its lines still cross the red surface exactly where ancient hands placed them, while the surrounding mountains continue toward the distant lowlands. And if only fragments of the original design have survived, what might the complete carving have revealed, and what meaning could still be hidden within the patterns that remain? The carved sandstone of Samaipata leaves behind a final image, a landscape transformed so completely by human hands that stone and intention become difficult to separate. But if mountains can preserve forgotten rituals, coastlines can conceal something even more elusive: the remains of cities that once connected distant worlds. Along the Red Sea coast of Eritrea, near the Gulf of Zula, the shoreline appears deceptively quiet. Dry plains stretch towards the sea, while fragments of ancient stone lie scattered beneath the surface. There are no towering monuments announcing what once stood here. Instead, the remains suggest something that may have been far more important than its modest appearance implies. This was Adulis. For centuries, Adulis served as a major port linking the Red Sea with the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, and regions farther east. Ancient sources describe it as an important commercial center associated with the kingdom of Aksum. Goods passing through the port included ivory, animal products, metals, textiles, spices, and other valuable commodities. By the 1st centuries AD, Adulis had become part of a maritime network extending across enormous distances. Ships crossed the Red Sea. Merchants moved through the port. Foreign goods entered the African interior, and information traveled with them. Yet today, Adulis is remarkably difficult to visualize. The ancient shoreline has changed. Sediments accumulated, coastal processes altered the landscape. Structures collapsed, were dismantled, or became buried. What remains is only a fragment of the city that ancient travelers once knew. One of the most intriguing clues comes from ancient writings. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, probably written during the 1st century AD, describes Adulis as an important trading port on the African coast. Later sources provide additional information, connecting the city with the powerful Aksumite kingdom. These texts suggest that Adulis was not an isolated settlement. It was a gateway. But what did the city actually look like? Archaeological excavations have revealed substantial stone buildings, religious structures, imported objects, pottery, and evidence of long-distance trade. Among the discoveries are remains associated with monumental architecture and inscriptions that provide rare glimpses into the political world surrounding the port. Yet, the archaeological record remains incomplete. The city extended across a broad area, and much of it has never been fully excavated. Some sections lie beneath layers of sediment. Others may have been destroyed or altered by later human activity. This creates an unusual problem. The written evidence tells us that Adulis mattered. The archaeological evidence confirms that it was substantial. But the physical remains do not yet provide a complete picture of how the city functioned. Was it primarily a commercial port, a royal gateway, a religious center, or a combination of all three? The answer may have changed over time. Adulis existed for centuries, and different communities would have used its buildings, roads, warehouses, and harbor facilities for different purposes. A structure that began as a commercial installation may later have acquired religious or administrative significance. There is another mystery surrounding its decline. By the 7th century AD, Adulis had lost much of its former importance. The exact causes remain debated. Changes in regional trade, political transformations, environmental pressures, and the rise of new commercial centers may all have contributed. Later traditions added more dramatic explanations. Some accounts have connected the destruction of Adulis with military campaigns or upheavals in the region. Others have imagined that natural disasters dramatically altered the coastline, helping erase the city from history. Environmental change is certainly relevant, but there is no single catastrophic event universally accepted as the explanation for Adulis's disappearance. The port may simply have declined gradually as the economic and political system supporting it changed, and that possibility may be more haunting than a sudden destruction. A city can disappear without being destroyed in a single moment. Trade routes shift. Harbors become less useful. Political power moves elsewhere. Buildings fall. And eventually, a place that once connected continents becomes little more than a name in an ancient text. More speculative theories have suggested that important sections of Adulis may still lie beneath the modern landscape or offshore, perhaps containing inscriptions, warehouses, religious structures, or evidence of commercial connections that have not yet been recognized. Such possibilities are reasonable as archaeological hypotheses, provided they remain grounded in evidence. After all, only a portion of the ancient settlement has been investigated. The Red Sea continues to move around the coast, while wind and sediment slowly conceal what remains. Somewhere beneath those layers may be the clearest evidence of how Adulis connected Africa with the wider ancient world. Perhaps an inscription naming a forgotten ruler. Perhaps a warehouse filled with imported goods. Perhaps the remains of a harbor installation that could reveal how ships approached the ancient coast. Or perhaps the evidence has already been lost forever. The ruins offer no final answer. They simply mark the location where ships once arrived carrying objects, languages, beliefs, and stories from distant shores. And if Adulis was once a gateway between worlds, how much of that vanished network still lies beneath the earth, and beneath the waters that now cover the edges of the lost port? The lost harbor of Adulis reminds us that even places built to connect distant worlds can eventually become almost invisible. Stone collapses, shorelines shift, and names survive long after the buildings themselves disappear. Far to the northwest, another monument has endured in a very different way, not as a forgotten city, but as a carefully arranged stone structure standing quietly within the Irish landscape. At Creevykeel, in County Sligo, low green hills surround a broad arrangement of pale stones. At first glance, it seems almost modest. There are no towering walls, no enormous statues, and no obvious indication of the thousands of years separating the monument from the people who built it. Yet, these stones were deliberately placed. Creevykeel is a court tomb, a type of megalithic monument found mainly in Ireland and associated with the Neolithic period. The monument is generally dated to the 4th millennium BC, placing its construction more than 5,000 years ago. Its architecture is remarkably distinctive. A long cairn encloses a central court, with chambers extending from it. Large slabs form walls and burial spaces, while the open court creates a transition between the surrounding landscape and the interior chambers. Why create a monument in this particular form? The conventional interpretation is connected to burial and ceremonial activity. Human remains were placed within the chambers, and evidence from excavations suggests that the monument was used repeatedly rather than for a single burial event. This changes the way the structure should be viewed. Creevykeel was not simply a tomb. It may have been a place where communities returned over generations, bringing the dead into a continuing relationship with the living. The court itself is especially intriguing. Unlike a sealed underground chamber, it creates an open space surrounded by stone. People could enter the court, gather, conduct rituals, and then approach the burial chambers beyond it. The architecture therefore appears to control movement. Outside, court, chamber. A gradual passage from the ordinary landscape toward a restricted interior. But what happened inside? Archaeology can reveal bones, charcoal, pottery, stone tools, and other physical traces. It cannot reconstruct the exact words spoken or the beliefs held by the people who gathered there. Some remains at court tombs show evidence of cremation, while others indicate different forms of treatment of the dead. Such practices suggest that Neolithic communities had complex ideas about death and transformation. Perhaps the dead were not regarded as permanently separated from the community. Perhaps the tomb was a place of transition, or perhaps its meaning changed according to the circumstances of each generation. Creevykeel becomes even more interesting when viewed alongside other megalithic monuments across Ireland and Western Europe. Similar broad architectural principles appear in different regions, yet each monument has its own arrangement, orientation, and local character. This has encouraged speculation about shared religious traditions spreading across prehistoric Europe. The more extreme versions of these ideas suggest forgotten priesthoods, astronomical systems, or even a highly organized civilization predating the cultures normally associated with Neolithic monuments. There is no convincing evidence for such a lost civilization at Creevykeel. The monument can be explained within the capabilities of Neolithic farming communities who possessed substantial knowledge of stone, landscape, construction, and collective organization. But explaining how something was built is not the same as understanding why it mattered. The stones reveal effort. The chambers reveal planning. The burials reveal repeated attention to the dead. Yet, the beliefs connecting all three remain partly inaccessible. There is also the question of what has disappeared. Thousands of years of weathering have altered the monument. Excavation inevitably disturbed some archaeological relationships. Organic materials have largely vanished. Objects may have been removed or destroyed long before modern investigation. The surviving stones are therefore only a fraction of the original evidence. Perhaps the surrounding landscape once contained additional markers, pathways, or temporary structures. Perhaps ceremonies extended beyond the cairn itself. Perhaps sounds, fires, offerings, and processions transformed the monument in ways that leave almost no physical trace. Standing among the stones today, it is easy to see only a ruin. But to the people who constructed it, Creevykeel may have been alive with movement and meaning. 5,000 years ago, someone decided that these particular stones belonged together. Someone planned the court. Someone carried the slabs. Someone entered the chamber carrying the remains of a person who had once been part of the community. The purpose survives only in fragments. And as the Irish landscape continues to surround the monument in silence, one question remains. If the stones preserve only the physical outline of a ceremony, what beliefs, rituals, and forgotten memories might still be hidden within the spaces between them? The stones of Creevykeel remind us that a monument does not need to tower above the landscape to possess immense power. Sometimes its significance lies in the arrangement itself, the measured space between walls, the direction of a passage, the place where the living once stood beside the dead. Across the Atlantic, another monumental landscape reveals a different expression of human order, this time shaped not from stone, but from earth. Along the banks of the Black Warrior River in Alabama, broad, grassy mounds rise from the surrounding plain. Some are low and rounded. Others form sharply defined platforms, their slopes descending toward a carefully organized central landscape. Trees grow across portions of the site today, birds move through the grass, and the river continues its slow course nearby. Yet, beneath this quiet surface lies Moundville, one of the most important archaeological centers of the prehistoric southeastern United States. The site flourished roughly between AD 1000 and 1450 and became a major center of the Mississippian cultural tradition. At its height, Moundville contained numerous platform mounds arranged around a large central plaza. Archaeologists have identified more than 20 major mounds within the principal ceremonial area, although the landscape has been altered by erosion, agriculture, and later activity. The arrangement is striking. The largest mounds were not placed randomly. They surrounded an open plaza that appears to have been central to ceremonial and political life. Some supported structures, perhaps the residences of high-ranking individuals or buildings associated with ritual activities. Others may have served different purposes over time. Why build such a monumental landscape? The conventional explanation begins with social organization. Constructing enormous earthen platforms required coordinated labor. Soil had to be excavated, transported, placed, and compacted. The process would have required planning and cooperation on a considerable scale. But the mounds were more than engineering projects. Their arrangement created hierarchy. A person standing in the central plaza would have been surrounded by elevated structures, some of which could only be reached by ascending steep slopes or approaching designated entrances. Height itself became a form of social distinction. The architecture communicated power without written language. And then there are the burials. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of artifacts from Moundville, including pottery, shell ornaments, stone tools, copper objects, and other materials. Some burials contain elaborate objects that suggest differences in status, identity, or ceremonial importance. Among the most famous artifacts are engraved pottery vessels and stone objects associated with the distinctive artistic tradition often called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. These images can be unsettling in their intensity. Birds with extended wings, serpentine creatures, human figures, weapons, symbols whose precise meanings remain debated. They appear again and again across objects from different Mississippian centers, suggesting that communities shared ideas, symbols, and ritual traditions across enormous distances. But shared symbolism does not necessarily mean a single centralized religion. Moundville may have been part of a broad cultural network in which communities adapted common themes to their own local traditions. The mystery becomes deeper when archaeologists examine how the site changed over time. Moundville was not static. Some areas were occupied more intensely during particular periods. Buildings were constructed, abandoned, rebuilt, and sometimes replaced. Population patterns shifted. The central ceremonial area appears to have changed in importance as the centuries passed. Eventually, the Great Center declined. By around the 15th century, Moundville no longer functioned as the powerful settlement it had once been. People did not simply disappear from the region, however. Communities continued to live throughout the Southeast, and the descendants of Mississippian peoples survived long after the monumental center lost its former prominence. So, what caused the decline? There is no single answer. Changes in climate, disease, political instability, shifting trade networks, warfare, environmental pressures, and changes in social organization have all been considered. The archaeological evidence suggests a complicated process rather than one dramatic catastrophe, and that uncertainty has created space for more speculative ideas. Some theories portray Moundville as the remains of a civilization whose achievements have been underestimated, while others suggest that its mounds encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge or vanished systems of mathematics. There are genuine reasons to examine these possibilities carefully. The orientation of structures, the regular arrangement of mounds, and the repeated use of symbolic imagery demonstrate that Mississippian societies possess detailed knowledge of landscape, architecture, and seasonal cycles. But there is an important distinction between sophisticated knowledge and evidence of a lost technological civilization. Nothing at Moundville requires explanations involving unknown builders or outside civilizations. The achievements are already remarkable when understood within the societies that created them. Perhaps the deeper mystery is why the monumental center was organized with such precision. What did the central plaza represent? Was it primarily a ceremonial space, a political theater, or both? Did the mounds symbolize a sacred geography known to everyone who lived there? Or did their meanings belong only to certain families, priests, or leaders? The earth itself cannot answer. It preserves the shape of the platforms, traces of structures, layers of occupation, and fragments of objects. But the voices of the people who gathered in the plaza are gone. Even the landscape we see today is incomplete. Some mounds were damaged before systematic archaeology began. Others were altered by farming, erosion, and construction. Ancient structures that once stood on top of the platforms have mostly disappeared, leaving the enormous earthworks without the buildings that originally gave them context. Imagine the site at its height, wooden structures rising above the platforms, people moving through the plaza, ceremonial objects carried between buildings, smoke drifting upward, the Black Warrior River flowing beside a densely organized center. Then, gradually, the activity diminishes. The structures decay. The plaza empties. The earthworks remain. Centuries pass, and vegetation covers portions of the landscape until the monumental city becomes difficult to recognize. Today, Moundville is both archaeological evidence and absence. Its mounds tell us that an organized society existed here, but they cannot completely explain the beliefs that gave the landscape its meaning. Perhaps future research will clarify the rituals, political structures, and reasons for the site's transformation. Or perhaps some questions will remain beyond recovery. Because beneath each grassy mound may lie another layer of evidence, another burial, another structure, another object carrying a symbol whose meaning has not yet been understood. And if the people of Moundville deliberately shaped the earth to express a vision of their world, what parts of that vision are still waiting beneath the quiet ground? The earthworks of Moundville reveal how entire landscapes could become expressions of power, memory, and belief. But earth can be reshaped with relative ease. Stone presents a different challenge. Once enormous blocks are moved into position, their weight preserves a record of decisions made thousands of years ago. In southern Spain, near the town of Antequera, a low entrance leads into a vast prehistoric chamber. Sunlight reaches only a short distance inside. Beyond it, massive slabs of stone rise from the ground and lean inward, supporting an immense roof. This is the Dolmen of Menga. Built during the Neolithic period, more than 5,500 years ago, Menga is one of the most extraordinary megalithic monuments in Europe. It belongs to a landscape that also includes the nearby dolmens of Vieira and El Romero, creating a remarkable concentration of prehistoric architecture. Menga is not a conventional tomb in the simple sense. Its interior consists of a long passage leading toward a large oval chamber. Enormous vertical stones form the walls, while several massive horizontal slabs cover the structure above. Some of these stones weigh well over 100 tons. The numbers alone are difficult to comprehend. A block weighing more than 100 tons does not simply move because a community wants it moved. It must be quarried, transported, positioned, raised, and stabilized, all without modern cranes, engines, or steel machinery. So, how was it done? The mainstream explanation begins with collective labor: wooden supports, ropes, rollers or sledges, earthen ramps, and carefully coordinated construction. Neolithic communities were capable of organizing substantial workforces, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that large stones can be moved using relatively simple technologies when enough people, planning, and time are available. But knowing that something is possible does not tell us exactly how Menga was constructed. No written instructions survive. No ancient construction manual explains the sequence. The builders left the monument, but not the method. That absence has encouraged speculation. Some observers have proposed that the monument reflects sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and there is a genuine feature that makes this possibility interesting. The entrance to Menga is oriented toward the landscape rather than directly toward a conventional solar alignment. From the chamber, the rising sun can be seen in relation to the Peña de los Enamorados, a distinctive mountain that dominates the surrounding horizon. This relationship appears deliberate. Archaeologists have increasingly studied Menga not as an isolated structure, but as part of a broader sacred landscape. The monument's orientation connects the interior with the natural world outside, suggesting that the builders may have incorporated mountains, sunlight, and the surrounding terrain into their conception of the site. The mystery is not necessarily astronomical. It may be something broader. What if the landscape itself was considered part of the monument? The mountain may have held symbolic meaning. The chamber may have been positioned to establish a relationship between the dead, the living, and the visible horizon. Inside, the atmosphere would have been profoundly different from the open landscape. The enormous stones create a compressed, enclosed space. The ceiling is supported by carefully arranged slabs, and the floor descends slightly toward the interior. A deep, well-like feature lies within the chamber, although its precise original function remains debated. Was it connected to water, a ritual activity, a later modification, or something whose original meaning has disappeared? The answer is not certain. And there is another remarkable detail. The stones were not merely placed next to one another. The builders selected and shaped them so that the monument could function as a stable architectural structure. Some surfaces show evidence of deliberate preparation, while others retain irregular forms. This suggests a balance between precision and adaptation. The builders did not need every surface to be perfectly geometric. They needed the monument to work, and it has worked for thousands of years. Menga survived because its builders understood weight. The massive roof stones rest upon the upright slabs, transferring pressure downward. The structure was partially buried, giving it additional stability and insulation. In effect, the builders created a stone-covered chamber capable of resisting forces that would destroy many ordinary structures. Its survival is therefore not mysterious in the supernatural sense. It is an achievement of engineering, but the intention behind that engineering remains harder to recover. The monument dates to a period when farming communities were spreading across parts of Europe. These societies possessed increasingly complex systems of agriculture, craft production, exchange, and ritual. Yet Menga demonstrates that their social organization could extend far beyond individual households. Someone had to decide where the monument would stand. Someone had to organize the quarrying. Someone had to coordinate transportation. Someone had to determine how the chamber should be oriented, and someone had to decide who belonged inside it. Human remains and archaeological evidence suggest that megalithic monuments such as Menga were connected with funerary practices, but their roles may have extended into ceremonies, communal identity, and relationships with ancestors. Perhaps the tomb was not simply a place for the dead. Perhaps it was a place where the living negotiated their relationship with those who came before them. More speculative interpretations sometimes describe Menga as an astronomical observatory, an ancient calendar, or evidence of knowledge far beyond what is normally attributed to Neolithic societies. Some astronomical relationships are real and worth investigating, but the leap from alignment to advanced, lost technology is much harder to justify. The monument does not need mysterious builders to be extraordinary. Its builders were extraordinary enough. They transformed local stone into a structure that has survived more than 5 millennia, using materials, tools, and organizational systems that remain only partly understood. And even today, the surrounding landscape continues to raise questions. Why was this exact location chosen? Why was the chamber oriented toward that particular mountain? What happened around the well? What ceremonies took place inside the darkness? And how did the people who built Menga understand the relationship between the chamber, the mountain, the sky, and the dead? The stones remain silent. Their weight has preserved the architecture, but not the voices that once filled it. Perhaps future archaeological work will reveal more about the monument's construction and ritual history. Perhaps another discovery will connect Menga with a wider network of prehistoric sites across the Iberian Peninsula. Or perhaps some meanings disappeared the moment the last builders walked away. For now, Menga remains an enormous question carved into the landscape. A monument whose engineering can be studied in detail, while its deepest purpose remains partly beyond reach. And standing before those immense stones, one thought becomes difficult to escape. If people 5,000 years ago could move mountains of stone for reasons we still struggle to understand, what else might they have known about their world that has simply not survived? The massive stones of Menga remind us that prehistoric builders could create spaces whose purpose survives only in fragments. But if the Great Spanish Dolmen draws the eye toward what was deliberately constructed above ground, another archaeological landscape invites us to look downward. Across the dry plateau of central Jordan, the ruins of ar-Rasas rise from the earth in scattered walls, towers, churches, and stone foundations. The landscape appears almost empty at first, yet beneath and between these surviving structures lies another layer of history, one involving cisterns, underground spaces, concealed foundations, and traces of communities that adapted to an unforgiving environment. This is ar-Rasas. The site, known in antiquity as Castron Mefa, developed over many centuries and became especially important during the Byzantine and early Islamic periods. Its remains include numerous churches, monastic structures, defensive walls, towers, domestic buildings, and agricultural installations. What makes the site unusual is not a single mysterious chamber. It is the complexity beneath an apparently simple landscape. Water was precious here. The region is semi-arid, and survival depended upon collecting, storing, and carefully distributing rainfall. Ancient inhabitants constructed cisterns and other water management installations, some cut into or beneath the ground. These underground reservoirs could preserve water after seasonal rains had disappeared from the surface. To modern eyes, such spaces can appear mysterious. A narrow opening in the stone, a descending passage, a chamber concealed beneath a building, a dark cavity whose original purpose is not immediately obvious. But in a settlement like ar-Rasas, the practical explanation is often the most revealing one. Water was life. An underground cistern could be more valuable than an impressive monument. Yet, the deeper archaeologists examine the site, the more complicated its history becomes. Ar-Rasas was not simply one settlement constructed at one moment. Its archaeological remains represent successive phases of occupation and adaptation. Roman influence, Byzantine Christianity, monastic life, and later Islamic occupation all left traces within the landscape. The site therefore behaves almost like a historical cross-section. One generation built, another modified, a later community reused. Eventually, structures collapsed and were incorporated into new walls. Below the visible surface, these layers can become difficult to separate. Some underground features may have served as storage areas. Others belong to water systems. Some spaces may have been associated with buildings whose upper structures have disappeared entirely, and this raises a deceptively simple question. How much of an ancient settlement can survive underground after its visible architecture has been reduced to ruins? Quite a lot. Stone foundations can remain buried beneath later debris. Cisterns can survive almost intact. Drainage channels can continue beneath collapsed structures. Earlier floors may lie beneath later ones, preserving evidence that would otherwise have disappeared. At ar-Rasas, the discovery of such features has helped archaeologists reconstruct how inhabitants managed their environment. But the site contains another layer of mystery. Its religious architecture is extraordinary. Several churches have been identified, and some contain intricate mosaic floors. Among the most remarkable is the Church of St. Stephen, whose mosaic includes representations of cities and regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. These images provide evidence of a world connected through religion, pilgrimage, administration, and trade. The underground spaces therefore belong to a much larger system. People did not live beneath the ground simply because they wished to hide. They lived within an environment where storage, water management, religious practice, agriculture, and architecture were closely connected. Still, underground archaeology inevitably encourages speculation. Could some passages have led to undiscovered rooms? Could earlier structures lie beneath the later churches? Could sealed cisterns preserve objects that have not yet been recovered? These are reasonable archaeological possibilities, particularly at a site occupied and modified for centuries. More dramatic interpretations sometimes imagine extensive underground networks, secret chambers, hidden treasures, or forgotten religious spaces stretching beneath the ruins. There is currently no compelling evidence for a vast subterranean city beneath ar-Rasas. But the absence of evidence is not the same as proof that every buried space has been identified. Archaeology works slowly. Excavation can expose one feature while destroying the original relationship between it and surrounding deposits. Other areas may remain untouched precisely because researchers are preserving them for future study. And underground spaces present their own difficulties. A chamber can be partially filled with sediment. A ceiling can collapse. A doorway can disappear beneath later construction. An opening that once seemed obvious can become invisible after centuries of erosion. The dry climate may preserve certain materials remarkably well, while other evidence is gradually destroyed. Then there is the question of abandonment. Ar-Rasas did not simply vanish at one identifiable moment. Like many ancient settlements, its transformation appears to have been gradual and connected to wider political, economic, environmental, and social changes. People left. Buildings were reused. Some structures were abandoned. Others continued serving practical purposes. Eventually, the landscape became quieter. But beneath that silence, the infrastructure remained. A cistern still cut into the rock. A buried wall still following an ancient alignment. A narrow channel still disappearing beneath the surface. These features may seem ordinary, but together they reconstruct the daily reality of a community that depended upon careful engineering to survive. Perhaps this is the more subtle mystery of ar-Rasas. Not whether an unknown civilization built an enormous underground world, but whether enough of the ordinary underground world has survived for us to understand how its inhabitants actually lived. What did they store? Where did they collect their water? Which passages connected buildings? Were some subterranean spaces deliberately sealed? And beneath the visible ruins, could earlier phases of the settlement still be waiting beneath layers that have never been opened? The answers may lie only a few meters below the surface. The stones above ground have already revealed churches, mosaics, towers, and centuries of cultural change. But the earth beneath them may preserve an older and quieter record. And somewhere beneath ar-Rasas, behind a blocked entrance or beneath an unexcavated floor, another fragment of the settlement's story may still remain, waiting for archaeology to determine whether it belongs to a forgotten ritual, an ordinary necessity, or something whose purpose has not yet been recognized. The underground spaces of ar-Rasas remind us that what lies below an ancient settlement can sometimes tell a quieter story than its monuments above. But in the hills of the Greek Peloponnese, the descent into darkness was given an entirely different scale. Here, enormous stone doorways lead into circular chambers buried beneath artificial hills, built with such precision that their purpose is clear, even if much about their meaning remains beyond recovery. These are the Tholos tombs of Mycenae. The landscape around Mycenae is rugged and dramatic. Limestone hills rise above narrow valleys, and the remains of a fortified citadel occupy a commanding ridge. Beyond the famous Lion Gate, the ruins of the Mycenaean center stretch across the terrain, surrounded by tombs that belong to an elite society flourishing during the Late Bronze Age. The Tholos tombs are among the most remarkable. Constructed mainly between roughly 1600 and 1100 BC, these monumental burial structures consist of a long passage called a dromos, a massive entrance, and a circular chamber known as a tholos. The chamber is covered by a beehive-shaped corbelled roof, created by gradually projecting stone courses inward until they meet near the top. The largest surviving example is the treasury of Atreus. Its entrance alone creates a sense of scale. The monumental doorway is framed by enormous blocks of stone, while the passage leading toward it cuts through the surrounding earth. Beyond the threshold, the circular chamber rises into darkness, its walls forming a near-perfect geometric enclosure. Standing inside, it is difficult not to wonder about the people who built it. How did Bronze Age engineers calculate the curvature of the chamber? How did they transport the enormous stones? How did they ensure that the corbelled roof remained stable? The basic engineering explanation is surprisingly powerful. The builders used carefully selected stone, prepared foundations, controlled geometry, and the principles of corbelling. Each successive course extended slightly inward, transferring weight downward and toward the walls. The surrounding earth also helped stabilize the structure. No unknown technology is required, but the achievement remains extraordinary. The builders were working more than 3,000 years ago without modern surveying equipment, mechanical cranes, or steel reinforcement. Yet the resulting structures have survived earthquakes, weathering, human destruction, and centuries of neglect. Their purpose appears to have been funerary. The Tholos tombs were associated with elite burials, although many were robbed in antiquity. Objects recovered from some Mycenaean tombs demonstrate the wealth and long-distance connections of the people buried within them. Gold, weapons, pottery, jewelry, and other prestige goods reveal a society whose rulers participated in extensive networks across the Aegean and beyond. But the tombs were not simply containers for possessions. Their architecture may have been designed to communicate status. The long approach to the entrance creates a controlled journey. The doorway establishes a transition. Then comes the circular chamber, enclosed beneath the rising stone roof. Movement becomes ritual. The living approach the dead through a carefully constructed sequence of spaces. And yet, the exact ceremonies performed inside remain uncertain. Did families return regularly? Were offerings placed within the chamber? Was the tomb reopened for later burials? Were particular objects associated with specific rituals? The archaeological record provides clues, but not a complete script. The name, Treasury of Atreus itself, reveals another layer of uncertainty. Ancient Greek traditions associated Mycenae with legendary figures such as Agamemnon and the House of Atreus. But the tomb was constructed centuries before the classical Greek writers who recorded those stories. There is no reliable evidence that the treasury of Atreus was actually the tomb of Atreus. The traditional name is therefore a later interpretation imposed upon a much older monument. This distinction matters. Mycenae became surrounded by mythology precisely because its ruins were already ancient to later Greeks. Massive walls and monumental tombs belonged to a world that had disappeared long before classical writers attempted to explain it. Perhaps the legends preserved distant memories. Perhaps they were entirely imaginative. Or perhaps fragments of genuine Bronze Age tradition survived through generations and were eventually transformed into myth. We cannot know with certainty. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested that the Tholos tombs were astronomical structures, initiation chambers, or monuments designed according to mathematical principles far beyond their funerary purpose. Their geometry certainly deserves attention. The circular chambers, carefully controlled proportions, and monumental entrances demonstrate sophisticated architectural planning. But there is no compelling evidence that they were primarily observatories or secret technological installations. The simplest explanation remains the strongest. These were monumental tombs built for powerful members of Mycenaean society. Yet, even that explanation leaves important questions unanswered. Why invest so much labor in a burial chamber? Why place it beneath a carefully constructed mound? Why create such an imposing approach to the world of the dead? Perhaps the answer lies in the relationship between architecture and memory. A powerful ruler could disappear. A dynasty could collapse. A political center could be abandoned, but the tomb could remain. The Tholos became a permanent statement that someone important had existed here. And eventually, even the people who built the tombs disappeared. Around 1100 BC, the Mycenaean palace centers underwent major disruption. The causes remain debated and may have included warfare, internal instability, economic changes, earthquakes, and wider transformations across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenae survived in reduced form, but the Bronze Age world that produced the Tholos tombs was gone. The great chambers remained beneath their mounds. Centuries passed. The identities of those buried inside faded. The names of the builders disappeared. Only the stone geometry remained. Today, the tombs can be entered by anyone who follows the ancient passage toward the circular chamber. The experience is strangely intimate. The enormous scale makes the space feel monumental, yet the chamber is also enclosed and silent. Perhaps that was intentional. A place designed to make the dead seem permanent. A place designed to make the living feel small. And somewhere beneath the soil around Mycenae, other tombs may still remain undiscovered, their entrances sealed, their contents untouched, their identities unknown. If the surviving Tholos tombs reveal only fragments of Mycenaean beliefs about death, what might an unopened chamber still contain, and what could it tell us about the people who built monuments meant to outlast them? The great tombs of Mycenae show how ancient builders used stone to create a passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But not every mysterious monument was designed as a chamber or a tomb. In the hills of Japan, a massive block of granite seems to defy an obvious purpose altogether. High above the modern landscape of Asuka, in Nara Prefecture, an enormous stone rests on a hillside. Its surface is roughly rectangular, yet its upper edges slope inward, giving it the appearance of a vessel carved from solid rock. Two large square depressions have been cut into its upper surface, while the underside appears to rest on several projecting supports. The object is known as Masuda-no-Iwafune, the stone ship of Masuda. It is one of the most enigmatic megalithic features in Japan. The stone is enormous, measuring roughly 11 meters in length, 8 meters in width, and around 4.5 meters in height. It is composed of granite, and its total mass is estimated at well over 100 tons. That immediately raises the practical question: why carve such a huge object? And perhaps more importantly, what was it supposed to do? There is no surviving inscription identifying its creator. No written record provides a definitive explanation. Archaeologists therefore have to approach the monument through its physical characteristics, its location, and comparisons with other features in the surrounding region. Masuda-no-Iwafune belongs to the broader archaeological landscape of Asuka, an area associated with powerful political and religious developments during Japan's Kofun and Asuka periods. The surrounding hills contain ancient tombs, stone structures, and unusual monuments. Some are clearly funerary. Others are more difficult to interpret. This has led researchers to consider whether Masuda-no-Iwafune was connected with ritual activity, astronomical observation, or some form of monument whose original function has been forgotten. One interpretation links the stone with the construction of an observatory or calendar. The two rectangular depressions on its upper surface have encouraged this idea. Their purpose is unknown, and their alignment has sometimes been discussed in relation to celestial phenomena. But evidence for a dedicated astronomical function remains inconclusive. The depressions may have had a practical or symbolic purpose that modern observers no longer recognize. Another possibility is that the object was unfinished. Perhaps its builders intended to carve it into something else but abandoned the project before completion. This explanation would help account for its rough surfaces and unusual geometry. Yet, even an unfinished monument leaves a difficult question behind. Why begin work on a granite block of this size? Moving or reshaping such material would have required enormous effort. The mainstream archaeological approach does not require a mysterious civilization to explain that effort. Communities in ancient Japan were capable of organizing large labor forces for monumental construction, especially in periods when powerful elites controlled significant resources. But Masuda-no-Iwafune is unusual even by those standards. Its shape resembles a stone vessel, which has inspired the popular name stone ship. This resemblance has encouraged more imaginative theories. Some interpretations propose that the monument represented a celestial vehicle. Others suggest that it may have been connected with legends of gods descending from the heavens. Still others have compared it with megalithic structures around the world, suggesting that ancient peoples possessed a shared understanding of monumental geometry. These ideas remain speculative. There is no archaeological evidence that Masuda-no-Iwafune was intended to represent a spacecraft or literal vehicle. Its resemblance to a ship is based largely on appearance rather than documentary evidence. Yet, the visual impression is difficult to ignore. From certain angles, the granite mass really does seem to resemble a vessel stranded on the mountainside. That is where the mystery becomes especially interesting. Human beings have always given familiar forms to unfamiliar objects. A mountain can become a face. A rock can become an animal. A monument can become a ship. Perhaps the name reflects how later observers interpreted an ancient structure whose original meaning had already disappeared. The surrounding geography may provide another clue. Asuka contains numerous stone monuments whose functions remain debated. Some are associated with tombs, others with ritual spaces, and others with uncertain purposes. Together, they suggest that the region's ancient inhabitants interacted with stone in ways that cannot always be reduced to simple construction. Masuda-no-Iwafune may therefore have belonged to a larger symbolic landscape. Its position on elevated ground could have been meaningful. Its orientation could have been deliberate. Its geometric cuts could have served a purpose that has not survived in written tradition. Or it may have been an ambitious project that was abandoned before its final purpose was realized. The problem is that all of these possibilities can fit some part of the evidence. and none completely explains everything. There is also the question of chronology. Dating the stone itself is difficult because granite does not preserve organic material that can easily be radiocarbon tested. Archaeologists must therefore rely heavily on surrounding evidence and comparisons with other structures. This leaves a gap. We can study the monument, we can measure it, we can examine tool marks and geological characteristics, but assigning it a precise date remains challenging. Perhaps future techniques will narrow that uncertainty. Perhaps another discovery in the Aska region will reveal a comparable structure with clearer evidence of its purpose. Or perhaps the stone will remain an isolated enigma. For now, Masuda-no-Iwafune sits quietly above the landscape, its enormous granite body unchanged while the world around it has transformed. A monument without an inscription, a massive object without an agreed function, a shape that resembles a vessel yet may never have been intended as one. The builders left behind the stone, but not the explanation. And as the hillside grows quiet again, one question remains suspended above the granite. Was Masuda-no-Iwafune a sacred monument, an unfinished experiment in stone, a celestial symbol, or something whose true purpose has simply disappeared beyond the reach of history? Masuda-no-Iwafune leaves us with a monument whose form seems to resist easy classification. Was it a ritual object, an unfinished work, or something whose meaning has simply been forgotten? In the highlands of Peru, a different kind of stone mystery appears, not isolated on a hillside, but embedded within the remains of an entire ancient city. Across the dry Andean landscape southeast of Cusco, long walls and rectangular structures emerge from the grass. The ruins form an orderly grid, with narrow streets, enclosed compounds, plazas, and defensive-looking boundaries. Among them, certain monumental entrances appear to command the movement of people through the settlement. This is Pikillaqta, one of the most important Wari sites in the southern Andes. The settlement flourished roughly between AD 600 and 1000, during the expansion of the Wari state. Unlike many later Andean settlements that developed organically around irregular terrain, Pikillaqta is strikingly geometric. Its buildings were arranged according to a deliberate plan, producing a city of repeated rectangles, walls, courtyards, and controlled passageways. And somewhere within this carefully organized landscape, the idea of the monumental gate becomes especially intriguing. What did an entrance mean in a city like Pikillaqta? At its simplest level, a gate controls movement. It decides who enters, who leaves, where people gather, and which spaces remain restricted. Pikillaqta's architecture suggests that movement itself was carefully managed. Long walls and narrow corridors separated different areas, while entrances created transitions between public and more controlled spaces. The city was not simply a collection of houses, it was an organized environment. The Wari state expanded across large portions of the Andes, establishing administrative centers and settlements that helped integrate distant territories. Pikillaqta appears to have played an important role within that network, perhaps serving administrative, ceremonial, residential, and logistical functions. Its construction required substantial planning. Stone was quarried and shaped. Walls were built from local materials. Thousands of workers may have been involved in creating and maintaining the settlement. Yet, the most striking feature may not be the individual stones. It is the repetition. Rectangular rooms appear again and again. Walls follow deliberate lines. Passages lead between enclosed areas. The entire settlement seems to have been conceived as a system rather than as a random accumulation of structures. That has encouraged comparisons with other ancient planned cities. Some researchers see Pikillaqta as evidence of sophisticated Wari administrative control. The standardized architecture may have helped create a recognizable political environment across territories that were culturally diverse. A person entering the settlement would encounter an architecture that communicated order. The walls themselves expressed authority. But what about the so-called megalithic gate? The phrase can be misleading if it suggests a single enormous doorway comparable to some famous stone monuments elsewhere in the Andes. Pikillaqta contains substantial stone architecture, but its significance lies more in the planned arrangement of the settlement than in evidence for an unexplained gateway built with impossible technology. Still, individual entrances remain fascinating. Their construction demonstrates that Wari architects understood how to use scale, symmetry, and restricted movement to shape human experience. A narrow passage can create anticipation. A wall can conceal what lies beyond. An elevated threshold can separate one social space from another. The architecture itself becomes a form of communication. And perhaps this is where the mystery deepens. Who was allowed to pass through certain entrances? Were some areas reserved for officials, religious specialists, or elite groups? Did visitors understand the layout immediately, or was the city designed to guide them through a sequence of spaces whose meanings depended upon status? Archaeology can identify walls and pathways. It cannot always reconstruct the social rules governing them. Pikillaqta also raises questions about why the Wari built such a settlement in this particular location. The site lies within a broad Andean valley, near routes connecting different ecological zones. Water, agriculture, transportation, and regional administration would all have been important. The conventional explanation is therefore practical as well as political. Pikillaqta could help control movement, resources, and communication across the region. But later interpretations have sometimes gone further. Because the city appears so carefully planned, some speculative theories portray it as evidence of advanced knowledge that was supposedly lost after the Wari decline. Others have suggested that its geometry encoded astronomical information or mathematical systems. There is certainly evidence that Andean societies observed celestial cycles and organized ritual life around the landscape and sky, but that does not automatically mean every architectural alignment was an astronomical instrument. A planned city can be highly sophisticated without being a giant mathematical code. The Wari achievement is already remarkable within its historical context. What remains mysterious is how such an extensive administrative system functioned across enormous distances, and how ordinary people experienced cities like Pikillaqta. By around AD 1000, the Wari political system had weakened, and Pikillaqta was eventually abandoned. The walls remained, the corridors emptied, the carefully controlled entrances lost their purpose. Grass returned to the spaces where people once walked. Yet, abandonment does not erase a city's design. The architecture still tells us that someone wanted movement to occur in particular ways. Someone decided where walls should stand. Someone determined which spaces would be open and which would be enclosed. And someone understood that architecture could shape behavior without a single written command. Perhaps the mystery of Pikillaqta is therefore not hidden in one enormous stone. It is hidden in the entire pattern. A city built like a system. A landscape divided by walls. Entrances that controlled movement. Spaces whose original social rules have disappeared. And beneath the surviving foundations, there may still be evidence capable of revealing how the Wari used these monumental passages and what ceremonies or political encounters once took place there. The stones have preserved the architecture. They have not preserved the instructions. So, when we stand before a silent gate at Pikillaqta, we can see where people once passed, but not always why they were permitted to pass, where they were expected to go, or what awaited them on the other side. And perhaps somewhere beneath the ruins, another entrance, another wall, or another sealed space still holds a fragment of that missing explanation. The walls of Pikillaqta reveal how architecture can control movement, separating one space from another through gates, corridors, and carefully planned boundaries. But there is a place where the boundary between architecture and water almost disappears. Here, streets are replaced by channels, foundations rise from the sea, and enormous basalt stones form the remains of a city unlike almost anything else in the ancient Pacific. This is Nan Madol. Off the southeastern coast of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia, a maze of artificial islets stretches across a shallow lagoon. Stone walls rise above the water, enclosing platforms, ceremonial spaces, tombs, and foundations. Narrow channels run between them, allowing canoes to move through the complex. At first sight, Nan Madol seems almost impossible to place. It is not simply a settlement. It is not simply a fortress. And it is not merely a collection of stone walls. It was a monumental political and ceremonial center built directly upon the reef. The site developed over centuries, with major construction generally associated with the Saudalur dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei before the rise of the Nan Warki system. Archaeological research indicates that construction began roughly around the 1st or 2nd millennium AD, with Nan Madol reaching its greatest importance during the later prehistoric period. Its architecture is astonishing. Builders constructed more than 90 artificial islets, using basalt and other stone, creating platforms surrounded by seawater. Some walls were made from enormous basalt columns arranged in alternating layers, producing a distinctive pattern that resembles giant stone logs stacked into monumental enclosures. Where did all that stone come from? The basalt was quarried on Pohnpei and transported across the island and lagoon. The exact techniques used to move the largest blocks remain uncertain, but there is no archaeological necessity for supernatural explanations. Human communities can accomplish remarkable feats of construction when labor is organized over long periods. Still, the logistical problem is formidable. Some stones weigh several tons. There are thousands of them. They had to be moved through difficult terrain and positioned on artificial islands surrounded by water. The builders were not simply stacking rocks. They were creating foundations, walls, pathways, ceremonial platforms, and controlled waterways. The lagoon became part of the architecture. Water was not an obstacle to the city. Water was the city's connective tissue. Canoes could move between structures, carrying people, food, materials, and perhaps political or ritual participants. This arrangement may have helped reinforce the authority of the ruling dynasty. Nan Madol appears to have been a highly restricted center rather than a densely populated ordinary town. Certain structures were associated with elite residences, ceremonies, mortuary practices, and political power. At its center stood monumental spaces connected with the ruling Saudalur elite. The most famous is Nandawas, a large ceremonial and mortuary complex enclosed by massive stone walls. Here, architecture and death became intertwined. The rulers were buried within the monumental landscape they had controlled in life. Yet, the site's original social organization remains difficult to reconstruct. Who lived there permanently? Who arrived only for ceremonies? How many workers were required to maintain the channels and buildings? How was food supplied? How did the ruling dynasty coordinate labor across Pohnpei? Archaeology provides pieces of the answer, but not the complete system. The island itself also creates a powerful atmosphere of isolation. Pohnpei is covered in dense vegetation and receives enormous amounts of rainfall. Streams descend from the interior, while mangroves and tropical growth surround the ruins. Over centuries, vegetation reclaimed many of the structures. The result is a place where stone seems to emerge from the jungle and water. That appearance encouraged legends. Pohnpeian traditions tell stories of twin brothers, Olosopa and Olosihpa, who are associated with the founding of Nan Madol, Some versions describe supernatural powers being used to move enormous stones. These traditions should not be treated as literal engineering manuals, but they are important because they preserve cultural memories about the site's extraordinary construction. Modern fringe theories have gone considerably further. Some have proposed that Nan Madol was built by survivors of a lost civilization, by visitors from distant continents, or even with technologies unknown to ancient people. There is no reliable archaeological evidence supporting those claims. The more grounded explanation is also more interesting. Nan Madol demonstrates what a highly organized island society could accomplish through generations of labor, political authority, local knowledge, and maritime skill. The city did not need outsiders. It required people who understood Pohnpei. They knew the stone, they knew the tides, they knew the channels. They knew how to construct stable platforms in a difficult coastal environment. Yet, one mystery remains particularly persistent. Why build the political center offshore? Part of the answer may have been symbolic. The separation from ordinary settlements could have reinforced the sacred and political status of the ruling elite. Crossing water may have marked a transition from everyday life into a controlled ceremonial world. The architecture itself created distance. The channels limited access. The walls concealed interior spaces, and the enormous stones made authority physically visible. Eventually, the Sodelur dynasty collapsed. Nan Madol lost its political centrality. The structures were gradually abandoned, and vegetation began to cover the stonework. The city remained, its rulers did not. Today, archaeologists continue to study the site, while conservation efforts confront a difficult environment of erosion, vegetation, rising water, and tropical weather. Much of Nan Madol has never been completely excavated. Some structures remain poorly understood. Some channels are partially filled. Some walls have collapsed, and beneath the vegetation, additional archaeological evidence may still survive. Perhaps an undiscovered platform will clarify how the city was organized. Perhaps a burial will reveal more about the ruling elite. Perhaps a carefully preserved structure will explain the purpose of a space whose function remains uncertain. Nan Madol does not need legends of impossible machines to be remarkable. Its real achievement is already extraordinary. A monumental city built across a lagoon by people who transformed an ocean-fringed landscape into a center of political and spiritual power. The stones still stand where they were placed. The channels still divide the islets, and beneath the tropical vegetation, the remains of a civilization's political world continue to wait in silence. If Nan Madol was built to separate rulers from ordinary life, to make sacred space physically unreachable, then how much of its original meaning has disappeared beneath the water, and how much of the city remains hidden beneath the vegetation, waiting to be understood? Nan Madol leaves us with the image of a civilization shaping water and stone into a political landscape. Far from the Pacific, on the rolling hills of Ireland, another landscape reveals a very different kind of monument. One built not across a lagoon, but upon high ground, where stone chambers were positioned beneath carefully constructed cairns. On the summit of Sliabnakayi, the wind moves across rough grass and exposed limestone. From here, the Irish countryside unfolds in every direction. Fields, distant hills, scattered settlements, and the changing light of the sky. Among the stones sit several ancient cairns, some partially collapsed, others still preserving their narrow entrances and internal chambers. These are the Loughcrew Cairns. The monuments belong to the Neolithic period and are generally dated to around 3,300 to 2,900 BC. They were constructed by farming communities thousands of years before written records existed in Ireland. At first, they appear simple: a mound of stones, a narrow passage, a chamber hidden inside. But their arrangement reveals something much more deliberate. The cairns were built on elevated hills, and several contain megalithic passage tombs. Within these monuments, large stones form corridors and chambers where human remains were deposited. The builders transformed natural hillsides into monumental spaces that could be seen from considerable distances. Why choose these particular summits? The answer may begin with the sky. One of the most remarkable features of Loughcrew is its relationship with the movements of the sun. At Cairn T, the largest and best-known monument in the group, sunlight enters the passage around the spring and autumn equinoxes and illuminates the chamber beyond. The phenomenon is striking. For a short period each year, sunlight travels through the passage and reaches stones deep inside the monument. This is not merely a modern observation. The architecture itself makes the alignment possible. The builders had to position the entrance with considerable care if they intended the rising sun to illuminate the interior at a particular point in the annual cycle. But what did that alignment mean? The simplest interpretation is that the builders understood seasonal change and incorporated it into their ceremonial architecture. Agricultural communities depended heavily upon the rhythms of the year. The movement of the sun could mark important transitions in farming, ritual, and communal life. Yet, the equinox alignment may have carried a deeper symbolic meaning. The passage tomb created a controlled relationship between darkness and light. For most of the year, the chamber remained dark. Then, at a particular moment, sunlight entered. For people standing inside, the experience may have been extraordinary. A beam of light appearing within a stone chamber could have transformed the space from a tomb into something more dynamic, a place where the living encountered the cycles of the natural world and the memory of the dead. But there is another layer to Loughcrew. The stones inside Cairn T and other monuments are covered with prehistoric carvings. Spirals, circles, lines, geometric patterns. Some resemble symbols found at other passage tombs in Ireland, including the famous monuments of the Boyne Valley. Their precise meanings remain unknown. They may have represented aspects of cosmology, ritual, ancestry, or the natural world. Or perhaps they communicated ideas that modern observers no longer possess the cultural vocabulary to understand. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some researchers and enthusiasts have proposed that the carvings encode sophisticated astronomical information. Others have suggested mathematical systems or detailed calendars hidden within the geometry of the monuments. There is evidence for careful observation of celestial and seasonal cycles, but the stronger claims remain difficult to establish. A spiral does not automatically represent a star. A geometric pattern does not necessarily encode a numerical system. The danger is that modern expectations can become projected onto prehistoric symbols. Still, the builders were clearly observing their environment. They understood the changing position of the sun well enough to construct an alignment that continues to function thousands of years later. That achievement alone deserves attention. And perhaps the greatest mystery lies not in how they observed the sky, but why they chose to bring those observations inside a tomb. The cairns were associated with human remains and ritual activity. They were not simply astronomical instruments, they were monuments to the dead. This creates an intriguing relationship between time and mortality. The sun returns, the seasons return, the people do not. Perhaps the architecture was designed to express precisely that contrast. Every year, light enters the chamber again, even though the individuals buried within it are long gone. Loughcrew Cairns. The monument becomes a place where human lives and natural cycles intersect. Yet, much remains uncertain. We do not know exactly how ceremonies were conducted. We cannot identify the social status of everyone buried there. We do not know whether the carvings had standardized meanings or whether different communities interpreted them differently, and we cannot reconstruct the sounds that once filled these chambers. Perhaps there were chants. Perhaps fires burned outside. Perhaps people gathered on the summit during particular times of the year. Or perhaps some rituals were deliberately restricted to a small group. The stones preserve none of this. They preserve only fragments. Over thousands of years, weathering has damaged the cairns. Some stones have shifted. Vegetation has altered the monuments, and human activity has disturbed portions of the archaeological record. Yet enough survives to reveal extraordinary planning. The builders selected elevated locations. They constructed enormous stone monuments. They carved symbols into the interior, and at least in some cases they aligned passages with the annual movement of the sun. All of this occurred without written instructions or surviving explanations. Today, the Loughcrew Cairns stand quietly above the Irish landscape. Their stones have endured while languages disappeared, communities changed, and generations passed. Perhaps the people who built them intended the sunlight to symbolize renewal. Perhaps it marked a sacred moment in the agricultural year. Perhaps it connected the dead with a cosmic order that was understood perfectly by those who stood inside the chamber. Or perhaps the original meaning was more complex than any modern interpretation can recover. The equinox light still arrives. It enters the ancient passage. It touches the carved stones. And for a brief moment, the architecture performs exactly as its builders intended more than 5,000 years ago. But if the sunlight reveals only one fragment of the monument's original purpose, what other meanings remain concealed within the carvings, the buried stones, and the silent chambers of Loughcrew? The light entering the chamber at Loughcrew reminds us that prehistoric monuments could be designed to interact with forces far larger than the people who built them. The sun returned year after year, while generations disappeared. Yet, in another part of the world, ancient communities express their relationship with time, memory, and the dead through hundreds of carefully arranged stone circles scattered across the landscape of Senegal and the Gambia. Here, the ground is flatter. The horizon stretches wide beneath an enormous sky. Grass moves in the wind, trees appear in scattered clusters, and the red-brown earth carries almost no indication of what lies nearby. Then the stones appear. Sometimes there are only a handful. Elsewhere, dozens stand together in ordered rows. Circular arrangements emerge from the landscape, their upright pillars weathered by centuries of sun and rain. Some stones are tall and narrow. Others are shorter and broader. Many are shaped from laterite, a hardened reddish stone abundant in the region. These are the stone circles of Senegambia. More than 1,000 stone monuments are known across the region, distributed through parts of present-day Senegal and the Gambia. The sites belong broadly to a period extending from the 1st millennium BC into the 1st millennium AD, although individual monuments have different dates. Their scale is remarkable. This was not one isolated circle. It was a monumental tradition repeated across a vast territory. At first, the simplest explanation seems obvious. Burials. Excavations have revealed human remains associated with many of the stone circles, along with pottery, beads, metal objects, and other artifacts. The evidence indicates that at least many of these monuments were connected with funerary practices. But the architecture raises another question. Why construct elaborate circles around the dead? The stones were not simply scattered across burial sites. They were deliberately selected, transported, shaped, and positioned. In some monuments, the stones form near-perfect circles. In others, multiple circles occur close together. Some locations contain associated burial mounds or additional structures, suggesting that the monuments may have formed parts of larger ceremonial landscapes. The construction process itself would have required organization. A laterite block had to be extracted. It had to be transported. Its shape sometimes had to be modified. Then it had to be raised and positioned beside other stones. No single monument required technology beyond the capabilities of an organized community. But repeated construction across hundreds of sites suggests something larger. A tradition, a shared idea, perhaps a social system that endured for generations. The mystery becomes more interesting when we consider the absence of written explanations. The people who constructed these monuments left no surviving texts telling us exactly what the circles represented. Archaeology can recover objects. It can identify burial practices. It can reconstruct diets, materials, and chronology, but it cannot easily recover beliefs. What did the builders imagine happened after death? Did the circles mark ancestral territories? Were they places where living communities gathered to honor important individuals? Did the stones represent social status, lineage, or connections between families? Or did the circles carry religious meanings that have disappeared completely? Several possibilities have been proposed. The strongest archaeological interpretation connects them with mortuary traditions and social organization. The monuments may have served as visible markers of important burial places, allowing communities to maintain relationships with ancestors across generations. This would explain why the stones were placed so carefully. A grave disappears beneath the ground. A stone remains. It becomes a permanent marker. But the repetition of the tradition suggests that the monuments may also have communicated identity. A community returning to the same landscape could recognize the stones as evidence of earlier generations. The dead became part of the physical geography, and geography itself became memory. Some more speculative interpretations focus on the geometry of the circles. Could their orientation have astronomical significance? Were certain stones positioned according to solar or lunar observations? Megalithic monuments around the world have sometimes been interpreted as calendars or observatories, and the Senegambian circles have occasionally attracted similar claims. Yet, evidence for a sophisticated astronomical system remains limited. The circular arrangement alone does not prove celestial function. A circle is also an effective and symbolically powerful form for gathering people around a central point. Its meaning may have been social rather than astronomical. Still, the possibility deserves consideration. The communities who built these monuments lived in environments where seasonal cycles mattered deeply. Rainfall, agriculture, livestock, and movement across the landscape were tied to changing conditions. They would have watched the sky. They would have understood the arrival and departure of seasons. But whether those observations were encoded into the stones is another question. Then there is the mystery of scale. Why do so many circles exist across the region? One explanation is that the tradition spread through cultural interaction, with communities adopting and adapting an established form. Another possibility is that several related traditions developed over long periods. Either way, the monuments reveal connections across a landscape much larger than any individual settlement. The stones may represent not one kingdom, but generations of communities participating in a shared cultural world. And yet, there is something unsettling about the silence. Imagine approaching one of these circles centuries ago. The stones would have been new. The surfaces would have been sharp. People would have known who was buried there. They would have understood why the monument had been constructed. Perhaps names were spoken. Perhaps offerings were placed beside the graves. Perhaps ceremonies occurred beneath the open sky. Then generations passed. The people who remembered the original burial disappeared. The stones remained. Today, archaeologists can stand within the same circle, measure its dimensions, analyze the soil, and examine the surviving objects. But the original voices are gone. Conservation presents another challenge. Weathering slowly alters the stones. Agricultural activity and development can disturb archaeological deposits. Some monuments have been damaged or displaced over time, and every disturbed site potentially loses information about how the stones were originally arranged. Even so, the surviving circles form one of the most remarkable archaeological landscapes in West Africa. They demonstrate that communities living thousands of years ago invested extraordinary effort in transforming ordinary stone into monuments of memory. There is no need for vanished super-civilizations to explain them. Their creators were capable of organizing labor, transporting heavy stone, maintaining traditions, and constructing monuments that endured for centuries. The deeper mystery lies elsewhere. What did the stones mean to the people who stood among them? Were they boundaries between the living and the dead? Symbols of ancestry, places of ceremony, markers of social authority? Or did each circle possess a meaning unique to the community that built it? The stones cannot answer. They stand beneath the same sky their builders once watched, surrounded by landscapes that have changed while the monuments endured. And perhaps that is the final mystery of Senegambia. Not how people managed to place stones into circles, but why they believed certain lives deserved to be remembered in stone, and what stories were once spoken beside these silent rings that can no longer be recovered. The stone circles of Senegambia show how communities could transform simple blocks of rock into enduring markers of memory. Yet, thousands of kilometers away, in western France, another prehistoric landscape reveals an even older and more elaborate relationship between stone, burial, and time. The countryside around Bougon is quiet. Fields stretch across gentle terrain. Trees break the horizon, and beneath the vegetation lie enormous earthen mounds whose smooth outlines seem almost natural. Only when approaching them closely does their geometry become apparent. These are the Tumulus of Bougon. Located in the Deux-Sèvres region of western France, the Bougon complex contains several monumental burial mounds constructed during the Neolithic period. The earliest structures date to around 4700 BC, making some of them more than 6,500 years old. That number changes the perspective. These monuments existed long before the pyramids of Egypt, long before Stonehenge reached its later form, long before writing appeared in most of Europe. And yet, the people who created Bougon were already building structures that required planning, collective labor, and a remarkable understanding of stone and landscape. The complex consists of several tumuli, including large elongated and circular mounds containing megalithic chambers and passage tombs. From the outside, they can appear almost featureless. A mound, a rise in the earth, a silent hill, but beneath the surface, architecture begins. Large slabs form walls and chambers. Passages lead inward. Stone roofs cover spaces where human remains were placed. The builders were not merely burying their dead. They were constructing monuments designed to control access to them. Why? The simplest explanation is funerary ritual. The archaeological evidence supports this strongly. Human remains have been discovered within the chambers, accompanied in some cases by pottery, tools, ornaments, and other objects. Yet, burial alone does not explain the extraordinary investment. Someone had to quarry the stone. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to construct the chamber. Then, earth had to be gathered and placed around the structure, creating a massive mound that concealed much of the architecture. The effort was considerable, and the process was repeated, again and again. Different monuments were constructed at different times, suggesting that Bougon was not the product of one brief building project. Instead, the landscape developed across generations. This creates a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the builders were not simply creating tombs. They were creating continuity. A monument built by one generation could become a place remembered by another. The mound itself became part of the landscape, a permanent landmark connecting the living with those who came before them. Inside, however, the experience would have been very different. The passages are narrow. The chambers are enclosed. Natural light is limited. Entering such a space would have meant leaving the open landscape and gradually moving into darkness. The architecture creates a psychological transition. Outside is the world of the living. Inside is the world of ancestors. Whether Neolithic people understood it in precisely those terms cannot be known, but the deliberate separation between exterior and interior is difficult to ignore. The complexity of Bougon also raises questions about social organization. How many people were needed to construct these monuments? Was labor organized by a central authority? Did different communities cooperate? Were certain individuals responsible for ritual decisions? The archaeological evidence cannot provide a complete answer. But the monuments demonstrate that these communities could coordinate projects extending far beyond the scale of an individual household. And then there is the stone itself. The builders had to understand the properties of local materials. Some stones could be transported relatively short distances, while others may have required more substantial movement. The techniques remain partly unknown. We can experiment with ropes, wooden sledges, rollers, and manpower. Such experiments demonstrate that prehistoric communities could move heavy stones using simple technology, but experimentation cannot tell us exactly what happened at Bougon. No construction blueprint survives. No ancient account describes the work. The builders left the monument, but not the instructions. This gap has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some have suggested that the arrangement of the monuments reflects astronomical observations. Others have looked for numerical relationships between mound dimensions, orientations, and solar cycles. There is genuine evidence that Neolithic communities paid attention to the changing sky and seasons, but there is no convincing reason to assume that every measurement at Bougon encoded an elaborate astronomical system. The Tumulus of Bougon showed how prehistoric communities could bury their dead beneath enormous artificial hills, turning earth and stone into monuments that survived for millennia. But on a remote island in the far north of Scotland, the relationship between stone and burial takes a more intimate form. The monuments can already be understood as sophisticated expressions of ritual and social organization. Their mystery does not depend upon hidden technology. It depends upon missing meaning. What did the people inside these chambers believe about death? Did they consider ancestors active participants in the lives of the living? Were the tombs visited regularly? Were remains moved, rearranged, or added over generations? Did particular individuals possess greater ritual importance than others? Some evidence suggests repeated use, but the exact ceremonies remain beyond reconstruction. Even the objects buried with the dead can only tell part of the story. A stone tool may reveal technology. A bead may reveal exchange. Pottery may reveal cultural connections. But none can tell us the words spoken beside the body. None can preserve the emotions of those who carried someone into the chamber. And perhaps that is why Bougon remains so compelling. The monument has survived almost perfectly as a physical statement while losing much of the intellectual world that created it. The mounds remain. The chambers remain. The stones remain. The people do not. Over thousands of years, vegetation covered the structures. Landscapes changed. Communities disappeared. New traditions replaced older ones. Yet the monuments continued to occupy the same ground. Today, Bougon appears peaceful. There is no obvious sign of the immense effort once required to construct it. But beneath the grass lies evidence of a society capable of transforming an entire landscape into a place of memory. And perhaps future archaeology will reveal another burial, another object, or another architectural detail that changes our understanding of the site. For now, the Tumulus of Bougon remains a remarkable contradiction. Ancient enough to predate many of the monuments normally associated with complex civilization, yet sophisticated enough to demonstrate planning, engineering, ritual, and collective purpose. The question is no longer simply how these people moved stones. It is why they believed those stones needed to remain, and if the mounds were intended to preserve a connection between generations, what stories were once carried into their dark chambers, stories that the stones have guarded for more than 6,000 years, but have never been able to tell. The Tumulus of Bougon showed how prehistoric communities could bury their dead beneath enormous artificial hills, turning earth and stone into monuments that survived for millennia. But on a remote island in the far north of Scotland, the relationship between stone and burial takes a more intimate form. There is no towering mound here, no vast circle. Instead, a single enormous block of sandstone rests within the open landscape of Hoy in Orkney. It is called the Dwarfie Stane. The stone appears almost ordinary from a distance, weathered, low, rounded by time, but approaching it reveals something extraordinary. A doorway has been carved directly into the rock. Inside is a small chamber excavated entirely within the massive stone. The monument is not built from separate blocks, it is the block. The Dwarfie Stane is one of the most unusual prehistoric monuments in Orkney, a region famous for its extraordinary concentration of Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology. Its precise date remains uncertain, although it is generally considered a prehistoric chambered tomb, possibly dating to the Bronze Age. The first mystery is immediately obvious. Why carve a burial chamber into solid rock? The conventional explanation is funerary. The interior contains a narrow passage leading into a small chamber, with stone-cut recesses that have traditionally been interpreted as spaces for human remains. Unlike the enormous passage tombs of Western France or Ireland, the Dwarfie Stane was created on a much smaller scale. But small does not mean simple. Someone had to select the stone. Someone had to decide that this particular boulder was suitable. Then came the difficult part. The interior had to be excavated. Without modern drilling equipment, this would have required persistent labor using stone and metal tools, depending upon the monument's precise period of construction. The work may have taken considerable time, and because the chamber was carved from a single block, mistakes would have been difficult to correct. A wall could not simply be replaced. A stone could not be moved into a better position. The builders had to work with the mass already present. Perhaps that explains something about the monument's unusual appearance. Instead of bringing stones together to create a tomb, the builders removed stone to reveal one. The process was almost the reverse of conventional megalithic construction. Build by subtraction. And that raises another question. Why choose this method? Perhaps the surrounding geology provided a natural opportunity. Perhaps the stone already possessed significance. Or perhaps carving directly into the rock created a symbolic connection between the tomb and the earth itself. The interior is remarkably compact. The entrance leads into a chamber containing two recesses, traditionally interpreted as burial spaces. The roof remains the original stone of the monument, creating an enclosed environment completely surrounded by sandstone. For the people who entered it thousands of years ago, the experience must have been intense. The daylight outside, the narrow doorway. Then darkness. The walls are not assembled. They are the interior surface of the landscape itself. This could have carried symbolic meaning. The dead were not merely placed inside a constructed building. They were placed within the stone. Yet, there is no surviving text explaining what the builders believed. Later traditions only add more layers to the mystery. Local folklore connected the monument with dwarfs and giants, and the name Dwarfie Stane reflects these later associations. Such stories cannot be treated as direct evidence of the monument's original purpose, but they reveal something important. The stone was unusual enough to generate stories long after its creators had disappeared. One particularly famous association concerns the Persian poet and traveler Shah Jahan. A later carved inscription inside the monument has sometimes been linked to the 17th century Persian traveler Major George Stuart of the British military tradition. But the exact history of the inscription and its attribution is itself tangled in later interpretation. What is certain is that the monument continued to attract attention long after its prehistoric builders were gone. That continuity is fascinating. The original ritual meaning disappeared. The physical object remained. New communities encountered it and created new explanations. This happens repeatedly with ancient monuments. When memory disappears, imagination moves in. Some modern theories have gone further, suggesting that the Dwarfie Stane was not a tomb at all, but a ritual chamber, astronomical marker, or even evidence of a forgotten culture possessing unusually advanced stoneworking techniques. There is little evidence supporting the more dramatic claims. The monument can be understood within the broader prehistoric tradition of chambered burial and rock-cut architecture. Yet that explanation still leaves unanswered questions. Who was buried here? Was the chamber intended for one individual or several? Was it reopened repeatedly? Were objects placed inside? Were ceremonies conducted at the entrance? And why was this particular block selected? The surrounding landscape may hold part of the answer. Hoi is dramatic and isolated, with mountains, valleys, and open moorland shaping the horizon. The Dwarfie Stane stands within a landscape where natural features themselves could have carried symbolic importance. Perhaps the monument was positioned deliberately. Perhaps the stone was already recognizable as a special landmark. Or perhaps its location was determined by practical considerations that have nothing to do with ritual. Archaeology rarely offers a single complete explanation. Instead, it gives us probabilities. The tomb interpretation is supported by its form. The prehistoric date is supported by comparisons with other monuments. The later legends are documented as part of the stone's cultural history. But the thoughts of the original builders remain inaccessible. Even the tools used to carve the chamber are not preserved as a simple instruction manual. Experimental archaeology can show that hard stone can be worked with repeated percussion, abrasion, and careful planning. But it cannot tell us how long the work took here. It cannot tell us how many people participated. And it cannot tell us what they felt when the chamber was finally completed. Perhaps the greatest mystery is the monument's intimacy. Many prehistoric tombs dominate the landscape. The Dwarfie Stane does something different. It draws the visitor inward. The entire monument is concentrated into a single rock. One entrance, one dark interior, a few carved spaces, a remarkable amount of human effort contained within a surprisingly small volume. Thousands of years later, the stone still sits where its creators left it. The surrounding world has changed almost beyond recognition. Languages have disappeared. Religions have transformed. Communities have moved across the island. Yet the doorway remains. The chamber remains. And the stone continues to raise the same questions. If this was a tomb, whose memory was important enough to justify carving an entire chamber into solid rock? If it served a wider ritual purpose, what ceremonies once took place inside? And if the monument's original meaning was already forgotten by later generations, how much of its story might still lie hidden, not beneath the stone, but within the silence surrounding it? The Dwarfie Stane showed how prehistoric builders could carve a chamber directly into a single block of rock, turning one enormous stone into a place of mystery and burial. But elsewhere in Ireland, the approach was different. Instead of removing stone from a massive boulder, Neolithic builders assembled enormous slabs into a structure whose most striking feature appears almost impossibly heavy. In County Carlow, surrounded by green fields and low hills, a huge capstone rests upon several upright stones. It seems almost suspended. The upper slab is enormous, one of the largest known portal tomb capstones in Europe. Its estimated weight is around 150 tons, although exact estimates vary. This is Brownshill Dolmen. At first glance, it resembles a simple arrangement of stones, a few upright blocks, a gigantic slab above them, perhaps a small opening beneath. But the simplicity is deceptive. The monument represents one of the most remarkable examples of prehistoric megalithic construction in Ireland. Brownshill Dolmen is generally associated with the Neolithic period, broadly within the 4th millennium BC. It belongs to a class of monuments often called portal tombs, characterized by large entrance stones supporting a substantial capstone over a chamber. The basic interpretation is funerary. These monuments were probably associated with burial and ritual activity. But that explanation immediately creates another question. Why build something so massive for the dead? The capstone alone demanded an extraordinary logistical effort. A block weighing well over 100 tons would have needed to be extracted, transported, and raised into position. The builders had no cranes, no engines, no steel cables, yet they accomplished something that still appears astonishing today. The likely answer lies in collective labor. Neolithic communities could use timber structures, ropes made from organic fibers, sledges, rollers, earthen ramps, and carefully prepared surfaces. The precise technique used at Brownshill remains unknown, but experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that prehistoric societies could move very large stones through coordinated effort. Still, the practical explanation does not make the achievement ordinary. It makes it human. Hundreds of people may have participated in the process. Others would have prepared food, tools, ropes, timber, and the construction area. The monument therefore tells us something about society as much as engineering. People had to cooperate. Someone had to organize the work. Someone had to decide where the monument would stand. Someone had to determine how the enormous capstone should be positioned. And the decision to undertake such a project implies that the monument mattered deeply. The portal tomb was not merely a shelter for bones. Its visible form transformed burial into landscape. The dead were placed within a monument that everyone could see. The enormous capstone created permanence. It announced that something important had happened here. But who was important enough to receive such treatment? That remains uncertain. Some portal tombs may have contained multiple burials, while others could have been used repeatedly. Human remains recovered from Irish megalithic monuments sometimes show evidence of complex funerary treatment, including cremation. The exact rituals at Brownshill are much harder to reconstruct. Perhaps the body was placed inside the chamber. Perhaps cremated remains were deposited. Perhaps ceremonies occurred outside before the burial. Perhaps the monument was revisited long after the original burial. The stones cannot tell us, and that silence has encouraged more speculative ideas. Some theories suggest that megalithic monuments across Europe were carefully aligned with celestial events. Others propose that their dimensions encode numerical relationships or calendars. There is genuine evidence that Neolithic communities understood seasonal cycles and observed the sky. But Brownshill does not require an elaborate astronomical interpretation. Its orientation and architecture can be understood within a broader tradition of monumental burial. Even so, the possibility of celestial symbolism cannot simply be dismissed. The people who built these monuments lived according to cycles of sunlight, rainfall, planting, harvesting, birth, and death. Their world was measured differently from ours. The sky was not distant decoration. It governed everyday survival. Perhaps the monument connected the dead with those larger cycles. Or perhaps its meaning was rooted more directly in ancestry and territory. A monumental tomb could establish a visible claim to a landscape. It could tell later generations that a particular community had belonged here. The dead became part of the land, and the land became part of collective memory. The location of Brownshill may therefore have mattered as much as the stones themselves. The monument stands within a landscape that has been transformed repeatedly over thousands of years. Fields, roads, vegetation, and modern boundaries now surround it. But beneath the modern appearance, the prehistoric terrain is still present. The dolmen has survived because of its sheer mass. The capstone remains where it was placed. The upright stones continue to support it. The structure has endured weather, vegetation, and the slow transformation of the surrounding landscape. Yet, survival has also created a strange illusion. Because the stones remain, it can feel as though the monument is complete. It is not. The original chamber may have contained materials that disappeared long ago. Organic objects decayed, wood vanished, textiles vanished, human remains were disturbed or degraded. The rituals disappeared entirely. What remains is the skeleton of an idea. Stone preserves the architecture. It does not preserve intention. And perhaps this is what makes Brownshill Dolmen so compelling. The mystery is not whether people could move a 150-ton stone. They probably could. The deeper question is why generations of people were willing to devote enormous energy to moving it at all. Was it a tomb for an important individual? A monument for an ancestral lineage? A sacred landmark? A place where communities gathered to reaffirm their connection with the dead? Or some combination of all these purposes? Standing beneath the immense capstone today, the scale is difficult to ignore. The builders wanted the stone to remain. They succeeded. More than 5,000 years later, it still dominates the landscape. But the people who placed it there have disappeared into time. Their names are unknown. Their language is lost. Their ceremonies are silent. Only the enormous stone remains, still resting upon its ancient supports. And if Brownshill Dolmen was created to preserve a memory, perhaps the most enduring mystery is this: whose memory was powerful enough to move a mountain of stone? And what did the builders hope future generations would understand when they saw it?